Hi there, and welcome to Outlaw Icons, where history whispers in the dark. Tonight, we step behind the camera, past the slow-motion swagger, past the Hollywood charm, and into the uncomfortable truth about Henry Hill, the man the world met through Goodfellas, the smiling narrator, the smooth-talking wise guy, the gangster who just wanted to be somebody. But what if the real Henry Hill wasn't the charming anti-hero we remember? What if he was something far less romantic? A compulsive liar, a reckless addict, a man who betrayed everyone around him, and then spent the rest of his life selling the betrayal. Tonight, we pulled back the curtain on the rat who rewrote his own legend. Before we begin, tell us in the comments, where in the world are you listening from? And what time is it there right now? We love seeing this quiet little underworld stretch across countries, across time zones, across the night. And if you enjoy deep dives into the hidden truth behind Mafia myths, make sure you subscribe and join us here in the shadows. Because every week, we expose another legend and reveal the story Hollywood didn't tell you. Now, take a slow breath. Let the noise of the day drift away. Let the neon lights fade. Let the courtroom doors close. Let the lies unravel. And prepare to step into the real world of the American Mafia, where loyalty was currency, truth was flexible, and Henry Hill was never the man you thought he was. This is Outlaw Icons, your sleepy dawn. Chapter 1, The Kid Across from the Cab Stand, 1943 to 1955. The first time he saw a man dragged into the back of the cab stand office, Henry Hill was not yet 10 years old. He would later tell the story differently, cleaner, smoother, almost glamorous. But in that moment, what he remembered was the sound, a door closing too hard, a chair scraping, a low voice that wasn't shouting but didn't need to, the kind of voice that made grown men swallow. He stood across the street, pretending to kick a bottle cap down the sidewalk, pretending not to watch. But he was watching. Brownsville, Brooklyn, 1943, a neighborhood that smelled of coal smoke and tomato sauce, where fire escapes clung to brick buildings like ribs showing through skin, where the line between respect and fear was thin as fishing wire. Henry was born on June 11 of that year, into a home that felt too small for his imagination. His father, Irish. His mother, Sicilian. Two different worlds under one roof. One preached hard work. The other understood power. He would grow up believing one of those worlds was stronger. The apartment windows faced the cab stand. Not just any cab stand. This one belonged to a man whose name carried weight in whispers. A capo regime in the Lucchese crime family. A man who didn't raise his voice because he never had to. From Henry's bedroom, he could see the drivers leaning against their cars. The men in suits arriving in the afternoons. The quiet exchanges of envelopes. The nods that meant something had been settled. To a boy watching from behind thin curtains, it looked like magic. Goodfellas shows this part almost exactly. The boy staring in awe. The suits. The cars. The laughter that sounded confident, unafraid. And that part is true. Henry did idolize them. He really did skip school. He really did hang around the cab stand, sweeping floors, carrying sandwiches, running errands for men who barely knew his last name. He later said it was like being adopted by kings. But what he never said, not clearly, was that kings do not adopt street kids. They use them. At home, his father believed in discipline the old-fashioned way. Bell first, questions later. The old man wanted his son in school, wanted him honest, wanted him safe. Henry remembered the sting of leather and the humiliation of neighbors hearing him cry. But even then, the pain didn't compare to the shame of feeling ordinary. Across the street, no one was ordinary. The cab stand pulsed with quiet authority. Men walked differently when they stepped out of that office. They stood straighter, spoke softer, like they'd touched something electric. Henry would later say he was treated like a son, that he was special, that the boss saw something in him early. But the truth is colder. In that world, boys like Henry were common. A half-Irish kid with big eyes and bigger hunger. Useful, disposable, replaceable. He wasn't chosen. He was available. He fetched cigarettes, delivered messages, watched for police cars. He learned quickly, learned when to speak. learned when silence carried more value than words. Silence was currency in that neighborhood. Spend it wisely, and you earn trust. The man who ran the cab stand didn't shower him with affection. He didn't take him under his wing in some cinematic gesture. He barely looked at him most days. But Henry filled in the blanks himself. Children are good at that. They build fathers out of shadows. The mobsters were everything his real father was not. Calm, respected, feared. When they walked into a bakery, people straightened up. When they spoke, others leaned in. They didn't punch walls. They didn't come home exhausted and angry from construction sites. They came home with power. And Henry wanted that more than anything. He started staying out later. The cab stand became his classroom. School felt like a distraction from destiny. Teachers talked about presidents and grammar. The men across the street talked about territory and loyalty. One felt distant. The other felt alive. He learned the language early. Words like associate, crew, tribute. They sounded complicated, but they were simple if you thought about them the right way. A crew was a family. Tribute was rent for protection. An associate was someone orbiting the sun, but never becoming the sun itself. That last word would follow him his entire life. Because here's the part the movie doesn't slow down for. Henry Hill was never eligible to become a made man. His father was Irish. In that era, bloodlines were everything. To be formally inducted into the Mafia, both parents had to be Italian. It wasn't just tradition. It was doctrine. Like a locked door with a sign that read, "Not for you." He could run errands. He could earn. He could bleed. But he could never belong. Did he know that at 10 years old? Maybe not in detail. But he felt it. The way you feel cold air slipping under a door. He was always on the outside edge of the circle, close enough to see inside, never close enough to sit at the table. Still, he worked harder than most boys his age ever would. He memorized faces, learned who outranked who, learned that a capo regime wasn't just a manager. He was a general commanding soldiers beneath him, and those soldiers had their own soldiers. A pyramid built not of stone, but of fear and favor. Henry loved the structure of it. At home, things were chaotic. His parents argued. Money ran thin. His father's temper flared like a match in gasoline fumes. But across the street, the system felt clean, clear. If you did your job, you were rewarded. If you broke rules, you paid. Simple, or so it seemed. He watched the men closely. The way they laughed. The way they never rushed. The way other adults deferred to them. It was intoxicating. Power without noise. Control without explanation. He mistook calm for kindness. Years later, he would tell interviewers that the boss treated him like a son, that he was protected, groomed, favored. But multiple associates would later dispute that. They remembered him as a kid hanging around. Eager, annoying at times, useful when needed, not special, not chosen, just there. The mythology of Henry Hill begins here, not in the crimes, but in the storytelling. He built his origin story like a man polishing a trophy. He made it shine brighter than it ever was. But back then, he was still a boy staring through glass. He skipped school more often, started carrying small packages. No questions asked. That was the rule. Questions were cracks in the foundation. And cracks spread. His father tried to stop him, beat him, dragged him back to class. But discipline without understanding only pushes a child further into the arms of someone who seems to understand him better. The cab stand didn't scold him. It rewarded him. $1 here, a pat on the shoulder there, a nod of approval. Those things can feel bigger than love when you're young. But reward is not the same as respect. By the mid-1950s, Henry was already being noticed. Not as a prodigy, not as a prince, but as a reliable errand boy who didn't talk too much. Reliability is gold in a criminal world. If crime is a machine, then silence is the oil that keeps it from burning down. And Henry was quiet when he needed to be. He would later describe those days as the happiest of his life. The neighborhood buzzing, the mob untouchable, the future wide open. What he left out was the reality. He was orbiting men who would never fully accept him. He was learning a code that would never grant him full membership. He was chasing a throne he could never legally sit on. And yet, he believed. Belief is powerful, more powerful than fact. Across the street, another door slammed shut one afternoon. Another man disappeared into the office. Another lesson about consequence etched into a child's memory. Henry didn't flinch anymore. He didn't need to. He had already chosen his side. And as the 1950s moved forward, as he grew taller and bolder and more involved, he didn't realize that the path he thought led to belonging was actually leading somewhere else entirely. Because the boy across from the cab stand wasn't being raised to become a king. He was being raised to become something far more dangerous and far more expendable. And one day, very soon, the men he worshipped would test just how loyal that little errand boy really was. Chapter 2: Teenage Crime and Early Arrests, 1955 to 1963. The first time the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, Henry Hill felt something he would never admit out loud. Relief. Not fear. Not shame. Relief. The chase was over. The pretending was done. He had finally crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. He was no longer the kid across the street watching men disappear into back rooms. He was inside the room now. It was the late 1950s, and Brownsville had changed its tone. The innocence that once lingered on the stoops had hardened into something sharper. Henry was no longer the wide-eyed boy sweeping floors at the cab stand. He was taller, leaner, his voice deeper, his confidence louder. The errands had grown heavier too. No longer sandwiches and cigarettes. Now it was packages, deliveries, stolen goods. The shift didn't happen overnight. It crept in quietly, like rust under paint. At first, it was small things. A case of stolen liquor from the back of a delivery truck. A few cartons of cigarettes that fell off a shipment. The language was always softened. Nothing was ever stolen. It fell. It got misplaced. It changed hands. Words were tools, and the men around him were masters at reshaping them. Henry absorbed that lesson quickly. He was still an associate, a satellite orbiting real power, but his orbit was tightening. The cab stand was no longer a playground. It was a gateway, and Henry wanted through. He began skipping school entirely. Not occasionally, completely. His father noticed. The beatings returned, heavier this time, laced with panic. The old man saw something coming that Henry could not yet see. But pain only pushed Henry further toward the street. The mobsters didn't hit him. They nodded at him. They called him kid in a way that sounded like approval. To a teenager craving identity, that approval was oxygen. By 16, Henry was involved in hijackings. The term sounds dramatic, but in reality, it was structured opportunism. Trucks moving goods through Brooklyn were like moving banks. If you knew when and where to intercept them, you could reroute entire shipments. It wasn't random chaos. It was choreography. A driver slowed at the wrong light. A car boxed him in. A conversation followed. Calm. Efficient. No screaming. No Hollywood theatrics. Goods were transferred. The truck continued on its way, lighter than before. Henry wasn't leading these operations. He was muscle. He was presence. He was an extra pair of hands. But he was there, and being there mattered. He would later inflate these moments, telling interviewers he was deeply trusted, that he was essential. The truth was less cinematic. He was learning, watching, being evaluated. Crime in that world was like apprenticeship. You start at the bottom. You proved yourself in small ways before anyone risked giving you something bigger. In 1960, at 17 years old, Henry was arrested for credit card fraud. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't a heist. It was basic fraud, stolen cards, forged signatures, quick purchases before anyone noticed. He liked the speed of it, the illusion of cleverness. But he wasn't as careful as he believed. The arrest came swiftly. A knock at the door. A ride in a police car that felt colder than expected. He would later describe this arrest as a badge of honor. In Goodfellas, prison is portrayed almost like a finishing school. Garlic sliced thin in a shared cell, wine poured into plastic cups, mobsters laughing over cards. But the first time he sat in a holding cell, Henry didn't feel like a made man in training. He felt small. The concrete bench was hard. The fluorescent lights hummed relentlessly. There was no music, no celebration, just the heavy realization that he was officially on record. His father didn't visit. His mother cried quietly at home. The mobsters? They sent a lawyer. That mattered to Henry more than family tears ever could. To him, that lawyer represented acceptance, protection, validation. But here's the reality that often gets blurred. Sending a lawyer doesn't mean you are family. It means you're useful. You are an investment. Investments are protected until they are not. The short jail stint didn't scare him straight. It hardened him. Jail, in that world, was proof you weren't soft. If crime was a ladder, arrest was a rung. You climbed by surviving it. And Henry survived it. By 1963, he served a longer sentence for his role in theft and fraud schemes connected to the crew. This time, the confinement felt real. The walls didn't feel temporary. The future didn't feel wide open. Prison is not the glamorous lounge the film suggests. Yes, mob associates often stuck together. Yes, they found ways to make conditions more tolerable than other inmates could. But comfort is relative. A mattress is still thin. A cell is still locked. A guard's footsteps still echo like a ticking clock, counting down your youth. Henry watched older inmates carefully. Some were proud. Some were broken. Some talked about loyalty, like religion. Others whispered regrets after lights out. He absorbed it all. In prison, he learned something deeper than how to cook pasta in a cell. He learned how disposable people can become. Men who once commanded crews were now reduced to numbers. Once your earning power vanished, so did your mystique. That lesson planted a quiet seed in his mind, fear of becoming irrelevant. When he was released, he returned to Brooklyn not as a king, but as a known quantity. His name carried weight among street-level associates. He had done time. That phrase was currency. It bought him credibility. But he still wasn't made. He never would be. The bloodline barrier remained invisible but firm. His Irish father's ancestry hovered over his ambitions like a ceiling he couldn't break through. The Lucchese family structure was rigid. At the top were bosses. Beneath them, capos. Beneath them, soldiers, officially inducted, sworn in with ritual and blood. Associates like Henry orbited around that core. Close enough to profit, never close enough to lead. That hierarchy was like a locked church. Henry could sit in the pews. He could donate to the collection plate, but he would never wear the robe. He rarely acknowledged this publicly. Instead, he constructed a narrative in which proximity equaled status. He told stories that blurred lines between soldier and associate, between trusted insider and eager helper. And over time, those blurred lines hardened in a legend. But during those teenage years, the distinction was very real. He still answered to others, still followed orders, still waited outside doors while decisions were made inside. His relationship with the crew deepened. He earned more money, bought better clothes, took pride in walking through neighborhoods where people recognized him. Fear and admiration often looked similar from a distance. Henry didn't care which one it was, as long as people looked. His marriage to the lifestyle began here, long before he married Karen. The suits, the cars, the rhythm of late-night meetings and coded phone calls. He loved the system. He loved belonging to something that felt bigger than his cramped childhood apartment. But belonging is fragile in criminal organizations. It depends on usefulness, and usefulness depends on performance. By the early 1960s, Henry was involved in more structured theft operations, hijacking shipments of clothing, electronics, liquor. Nothing overly sophisticated, no elaborate blueprints or high-tech gadgets, just information, timing, and coordination, like intercepting a train by knowing its schedule. Still, even as he climbed, he was not the mastermind he later portrayed himself as. He was reliable, bold, sometimes reckless, but not strategic. The strategic thinking belonged to others. Men who calculated risk like accountants calculate tax deductions. Henry preferred movement, action, the thrill of execution. The risk itself became addictive. An addiction, whether to cocaine or danger, follows the same pattern. The first time feels powerful. The second feels necessary. By the 10th, you no longer feel complete without it. His early arrests did not slow him down. They accelerated him. Every brush with law enforcement reinforced a narrative in his head that he was part of something powerful enough to survive scrutiny. that he was protected, shielded. But protection is conditional. It lasts only as long as you generate more value than risk. During this period, he also learned how violence functioned as punctuation. Not constant, not chaotic, but precise. A beating was a message. A threat was a warning shot across a bow. Violence was rarely random. It was calculated discipline within the underworld. Henry participated in beatings during these years, not as a leader, but as an enforcer. His hands became part of that punctuation. The film softens this. Reality does not. Violence stains differently in memory than in movies. There is no soundtrack, no stylized lighting, just breath, impact, silence afterward. And Henry learned to live with that silence. As 1963 closed, he was no longer the boy outside the cab stand. He was embedded in the machinery. A cog, yes, but a working one. The arrests had not frightened him away. They had branded him, and he wore the brand proudly. But what he didn't yet realize, what he would only understand decades later, was that every arrest also built a paper trail. Every charge, every fingerprint, every court appearance stitched his name into federal databases that do not forget. The system he thought he was beating was quietly recording him, cataloging him, preparing for a future confrontation he couldn't yet see. He believed he was climbing, and in some ways he was. But ladders leaning against criminal empires often rest on unstable walls. The higher you go, the harder the fall. And Henry Hill, at 20 years old, felt invincible. He had survived beatings from his father. He had survived jail. He had survived the scrutiny of older mobsters testing his loyalty. What he had not yet faced was betrayal. Not from the police, not from rivals, but from within the very circle he was desperate to belong to. Because in that world, the same men who protected you could one day decide you were expendable. And Henry, still chasing validation, still orbiting a sun he could never become, had no idea how close he was to learning that lesson. Chapter 3. The Real Jimmy Burke, 1960s. The night Jimmy Burke laughed at him, Henry didn't know whether to feel honored or humiliated. The laugh wasn't loud. It wasn't mocking. It was quiet, almost private, like a man amused by a child trying to sit at an adult table. They were standing behind a warehouse in Queens, the air thick with gasoline and damp cardboard. A hijacked truck had just been unloaded in record time. Suits, televisions, cartons of liquor, all moved with mechanical precision. Henry was flushed with adrenaline. He thought he'd done something impressive. "You're learning," Jimmy said, smiling without warmth. That was the closest Henry would ever get to praise. By the mid-1960s, James Burke was already a legend in certain corners of New York. Not because he was loud, not because he bragged, but because things happened around him. Trucks disappeared. Cargo reappeared elsewhere. Problems resolved themselves. Burke operated like a chess player in a room full of checkers boards, always thinking several moves ahead, always calm. Goodfellas presents Henry Hill as Jimmy's trusted right-hand man, almost a partner, a loyal lieutenant with insight into every move. The truth is colder. Henry was useful. Jimmy was calculating. There's a difference. Burke was Irish-American, like Henry's father. That fact created an unspoken bond. They were outsiders inside an Italian structure. Neither could be formally inducted as made men. But Burke had already built something more powerful than ritual membership: influence. He had long-standing relationships within the Lucchese family. He earned. He delivered results. He commanded loyalty through fear and reward. Henry admired that deeply. If Paul Vario was the sun Henry orbited as a child, Jimmy Burke was the gravitational force that pulled him into something darker. Burke didn't waste time mentoring. He evaluated, tested, observed. Henry noticed quickly that Jimmy rarely raised his voice. He didn't need to. When he spoke, men leaned forward. Burke ran hijackings like clockwork. A truck loaded with clothing might leave Manhattan at noon and arrive in Brooklyn empty by 1. No gunshots, no chaos, just speed and coordination. It was like intercepting a river midstream and rerouting it without anyone upstream realizing it had changed direction. Henry loved that efficiency. He was brought into operations not because he was special, but because he was eager. And eagerness can be molded. Jimmy needed men who followed orders without embellishment. Henry followed. The warehouse floors were cold in winter. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead while stolen goods were sorted and redistributed. Henry carried crates, stacked boxes, handled paperwork that wasn't paperwork at all. He felt closer to the center of power than ever before. But proximity can create illusions. Henry would later describe himself as deeply trusted by Burke, as someone privy to inside strategy. As a confidant, FBI files and testimony from other associates paint a more grounded picture. Henry was involved. Yes. Present. Yes. Trusted with tasks. Yes. But he was not strategic command. He was execution. Burke selected men the way a general selects soldiers, not based on friendship, but on performance. And performance in that world meant two things: silence and profit. Henry proved he could provide both. He became a reliable participant in hijackings. He learned the routes, learned which trucking companies were vulnerable, learned how to identify drivers who could be intimidated without violence escalating. Jimmy taught without lecturing. If a job went smoothly, he said nothing. If it went poorly, the correction was immediate, sometimes verbal, sometimes physical. Henry witnessed both. There was a moment, late one evening, when a young associate panicked during a truck stop intercept. The driver resisted. The associate hesitated. Burke stepped forward calmly, pressed a gun against the driver's ribs, and whispered something too soft for Henry to hear. The driver complied instantly. Later, Burke looked at the associate and said quietly, "You don't hesitate when money's on the line." That was the lesson. Henry absorbed it. He admired Jimmy's discipline. The man didn't drink heavily during jobs, didn't indulge recklessly, didn't draw unnecessary attention. Burke dressed well, but not flashy. He avoided chaos. He built networks, bars, air freight connections, longshoremen. Every relationship was an artery feeding revenue back to the crew. Henry began spending more time at Robert's Lounge, the bar in Queens that functioned as both social club and operational hub. Smoke hung thick in the air. Laughter rose and fell in uneven waves. Deals were made over card games. Cash counted discreetly under tables. In those dimly lit rooms, Henry felt significant. He had a seat at the table, but not the head. He began making more money than he ever had. Cash flowed in envelopes. He bought better suits, took pride in walking into restaurants and being recognized. Recognition, to Henry, was oxygen. Burke, however, did not chase recognition. He chased control. That difference would matter later. Throughout the 1960s, hijacking became almost routine. It wasn't glamorous. It was repetitive. A conveyor belt of theft. Trucks loaded with food, appliances, clothing, liquor. Everything had value somewhere. Everything could be resold. Henry often described this period as thrilling, and it was. But it was also structured. A machine. And machines don't love you back. Burke was not a sentimental leader. He did not build father-son relationships. He built profit chains. If you earned, you stayed. If you caused risk, you disappeared. Henry watched men vanish quietly. No headlines. No explanations. Just absence. But he never believed he could be one of them. He felt chosen. And that belief shaped his later storytelling. When he later sat with journalists, he portrayed himself as central to Burke's operations, as someone whose opinion carried weight, whose presence altered outcomes. The records suggest otherwise. Henry was valuable, yes, but replaceable. He was not consulted on strategy. He was informed of assignments. He did not approve operations. He participated in them. He did not manage Burke's network. He worked within it. But perception is powerful. And Henry cultivated perception like a garden. There is something intoxicating about standing near a powerful man. The glow reflects onto you. Henry mistook that reflection for ownership. He also began developing a deeper tolerance for violence. Burke's world was not soft. Mistakes carried consequences. Debts were enforced. Disloyalty was punished. Henry participated in beatings during this era. Not random brutality. Targeted intimidation. If crime was a language, violence was punctuation. He did not always enjoy it, but he did not refuse it either. His identity solidified during these years, not as a mastermind, not as a boss, as a dependable operator. Burke appreciated that. There were nights when they sat at the bar long after others left. Burke would speak in fragments about discipline, about never letting emotion override calculation, about avoiding unnecessary noise. Henry listened like a student in a master class. But Jimmy never called him partner, never called him equal, and that silence mattered. By the late 1960s, Henry was married. Karen entered his life during this time. The lifestyle dazzled her. The suits, the money, the confidence. Burke tolerated Karen. He tolerated Henry's growing domestic life. But tolerance is not endorsement. Burke valued loyalty above all. Loyalty to the crew, to the earning structure, to the code. Henry believed loyalty meant proximity, that if he stayed close, stayed useful, he was protected. He did not yet understand that loyalty in organized crime is transactional. It exists until it doesn't. There were whispers even then about Burke's ruthlessness. Stories about men who skimmed money, about associates who talked too much. The consequences were swift, sometimes final. Henry saw enough to know the truth. Jimmy's calm exterior hid a blade, but admiration can blind you. Henry would later claim he was like a son to Jimmy, that Burke saw potential in him beyond utility. Other associates remembered it differently. They saw Henry as enthusiastic, energetic, a good earner, not family. Family implies sacrifice. Burke sacrificed nothing for sentiment. As the 1960s drew toward their end, Henry's confidence grew. He felt established, embedded, important. But importance in that world is measured by control over territory and men. Henry controlled neither. He was climbing, yes, but he was climbing inside someone else's structure. He didn't see the ceiling. Not yet. And somewhere beneath the surface, beneath the laughter at Robert's lounge and the steady rhythm of hijacked cargo, a truth was forming quietly. Jimmy Burke did not build successors. He built shields. And one day, Henry Hill would realize that being close to a man like Burke did not make you powerful. It made you expendable. The first crack in that illusion was still years away. But when it came, it would change everything. Chapter 4, Violence, What the Movie Softens. The first time he heard a man beg, Henry Hill told himself it wasn't his problem. The warehouse was cold that night, colder than usual, the kind of cold that makes breath visible and guilt invisible. The man on the floor wasn't screaming. He wasn't even fighting anymore. He was explaining, promising, pleading in fragments. Henry stood near the door, hands shoved in his jacket pockets, pretending he was just security, just backup, just there in case something went wrong. But something had already gone wrong. Goodfellas gives us violence that moves fast, sharp, stylized, almost rhythmic. A quick punch, a sudden explosion of rage, a dramatic crescendo. It feels chaotic but cinematic. What it doesn't show, what it can't quite linger on, is the slow part, the part where nobody is talking, where the sound of breathing becomes louder than any threat, where the room smells like sweat and metal and fear. Henry was there for that part more often than he later admitted. In the late 1960s, as hijackings became routine and the money started flowing with steady confidence, violence wasn't a spectacle. It was maintenance. It was the oil change in a criminal engine. Necessary, quiet, efficient. A man skimmed money from a job. A debtor missed payments. A driver talked too loosely at a bar. None of it required murder. Most of it required correction. Correction meant fists. Sometimes worse. Henry learned early that intimidation works best when it doesn't look dramatic. A public beating sends a message, but a private one carves it deeper. He would later say he wasn't particularly violent, that he mostly handled logistics, that he was more businessman than enforcer. The truth is more complicated. He wasn't the most violent man in the room, but he wasn't innocent either. He participated in beatings. He carried guns. He stood close enough to feel bone crack under impact. He didn't flinch as often as he used to. The first time his knuckles split open against someone's jaw, he went home and stared at his hands for a long time. The skin swelling, the redness blooming slowly. He flexed his fingers like he was testing new tools. He told himself it was part of the job. Violence in that world was like punctuation in a sentence. You didn't use it constantly, but when you did, it had to land cleanly. A period, a comma, an exclamation point. Henry began to understand its grammar. There was a man who owed money on a gambling debt, small at first, then larger, growing like mold in a damp basement. He kept promising he'd pay next week. Always next week. Burke didn't scream. He didn't threaten. He simply said, "Go talk to him." Henry and another associate found the man in his apartment. The television was on. The man's wife stood in the kitchen doorway, hands shaking slightly, pretending she couldn't hear what was happening. Henry tried calm first. Words first. The man kept explaining, kept stalling. The shift happened without warning. A hand around the collar, a shove into a wall, a punch that landed heavier than intended. Or maybe exactly as intended. Henry felt the moment stretch. The part where you either stop or continue. He continued. Afterward, the man paid. Henry didn't talk about that night later. It didn't make for a good anecdote. It wasn't cinematic. It was domestic. Ugly. Close range. No music playing in the background. He began understanding something darker. Violence wasn't always about anger. Sometimes it was about fear management. If crime is a business, fear is overhead. You either control it or it controls you. Henry wanted control. In interviews decades later, he sometimes claimed he wasn't directly involved in murders, that he was near them, aware of them, but not a trigger man. In other interviews, he hinted at deeper involvement. The stories shifted slightly each time. Names changed. Details moved. He inserted himself into rooms he may not have entered. He removed himself from scenes that were harder to justify. That inconsistency is telling. Because while there is no confirmed record of Henry Hill personally committing a documented homicide during these years, he absolutely operated inside a culture where murder was not rare. He knew men who vanished. He watched chairs at Robert's Lounge sit empty after someone crossed the wrong line. He heard explanations that were brief and final. He's gone. Gone where? No one asked. Silence was survival. There was a night at a Queen's bar when a fight broke out with a man who didn't understand who he was insulting. The argument escalated fast. Words turned into shoves. A bottle shattered. Henry was close enough to feel glass brush his coat sleeve. He stepped in, not to stop it, but to finish it. A quick punch. A knee to the ribs. The man crumpled. Later, Henry laughed about it, told the story like it was a joke. But what he didn't say was how quiet the bar became afterward. How everyone avoided eye contact. How even the bartender wiped the counter slower than usual. Respect and fear often look identical. Henry convinced himself it was respect. As the years moved forward, the violence grew less shocking to him. The body adjusts. The mind recalibrates. The first time you see blood, it lingers in your memory. The 10th time, it becomes background. That numbness frightened him more than the violence itself. But he buried that fear quickly. He liked being seen as capable, reliable, not soft. In that world, softness was liability, and liability gets cut loose. He began carrying a gun more regularly, not always visible, tucked into a waistband, under a car seat, hidden in the lining of a jacket. The weight became familiar, comforting in a strange way. A gun in that world wasn't just a weapon. It was insurance. It was punctuation that didn't need to be used to be understood. There were rumors during those years that Henry may have been present during at least one fatal outcome involving another associate. Rumors are smoke. Hard to grab. Hard to confirm. What we know is that he was close enough to violence to understand its choreography intimately. He learned that murder and organized crime rarely looks like movie chaos. It looks like planning. It looks like timing. It looks like doors closing softly. He was never the loudest man in the room. He didn't need to be. He was learning from men who preferred quiet efficiency. But something else was happening beneath the surface. Every act of violence leaves a mark. Not always visible, but cumulative. Like water carving stone over time. Henry's internal justifications became smoother, cleaner. He told himself these men deserved it. That debts are debts. That loyalty demands enforcement. But enforcement changes you. There was a moment, one he rarely described, when he stood outside a warehouse after a job went wrong. An associate had skimmed money. Burke handled it. Henry stayed outside, waiting. The door opened. Two men carried something heavy wrapped in plastic. Henry didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. The message was clear. And that night, driving home, he realized something that unsettled him. He wasn't afraid of Jimmy Burke. He was afraid of disappointing him. That fear is more powerful because it binds you tighter. In Goodfellas, Henry's violence is often overshadowed by louder personalities. By Joe Pesci's explosive portrayal of Tommy DeSimone. By Jimmy's cold stare. Henry feels like a narrator drifting through chaos. But in reality, he wasn't drifting. He was participating. He chose to stay. He chose to punch. He chose to carry weapons. He chose to remain silent. And each choice layered onto the next. By the early 1970s, Henry was no longer surprised by brutality. He understood it as infrastructure. Necessary to maintain revenue streams. Necessary to maintain hierarchy. The hierarchy itself depended on violence the way a building depends on steel beams hidden behind walls. You don't see them, but they hold everything up. Henry stood inside that structure willingly. He later tried to soften this period, to frame himself as less cruel, less involved, as if he was merely swept along by stronger personalities. But the records, the testimonies, and his own earlier statements suggest otherwise. He wasn't the most violent man in the Lucchese orbit, but he was far from passive. And here's the part that rarely gets acknowledged. Violence wasn't just external for Henry. It crept inward. He began snapping at Karen more frequently. The adrenaline of the street followed him home. The line between enforcement and domestic frustration blurred. A slammed door, a raised voice, a shove. He justified it as stress. He never connected the dots fully, but the dots were there. Crime requires compartmentalization. You put brutality in one box, family in another. But boxes leak. Henry liked to say he wasn't a killer. Maybe he wasn't a triggerman. But he helped sustain a system where killing was routine. And systems don't function without participants. By the end of this era, something had shifted inside him permanently. The boy who once watched violence through a window had become a man who delivered it. He didn't brag about every incident. He didn't need to. He carried it quietly. And somewhere deep beneath the confidence, beneath the laughter at Robert's lounge, beneath the polished shoes and growing bank envelopes, there was a quiet realization forming. Violence solves problems in the short term, but it creates debts of a different kind. Debts that don't show up on paper. Debts that wait. Henry didn't know it yet. But one day, the violence he helped normalize would circle back. Not with fists, not with guns, but with something far more destabilizing. Fear. And when that fear finally arrived, it wouldn't come from rivals. It would come from Chapter 5, Karen Hill and Domestic Abuse. The first time Karen pointed a gun at him, Henry didn't laugh. He would later tell the story like it was romantic, like it proved passion, like it was a scene out of a twisted fairy tale, the gangster's wife driven wild with love and jealousy. But that night, standing in their bedroom with the barrel pressed awkwardly against his forehead, Henry felt something colder than fear. He felt exposure. The apartment was quiet except for Karen's breathing. Fast, shallow, the kind of breathing that comes from betrayal, not rage. He could see her hands trembling, not because she wanted to pull the trigger, but because she didn't understand how she had ended up here, married to a man who lived two lives and gave her only fragments of both. Goodfellas frames their relationship as intoxicating. Seduction, glamour, fur coats, and cash in envelopes. A suburban home built on adrenaline. And yes, some of that was real. Karen Friedman met Henry in the mid-1960s. She was young, curious, attracted to confidence. Henry walked differently than other men. He carried himself like someone who didn't ask permission. That magnetism is real. But magnetism is not stability. When Karen first saw him, she saw the suits, the easy money, the way people deferred to him in restaurants. She saw power without fully understanding its cost. Henry courted her like he approached crime, with confidence and calculated charm. Flowers, dinners, long drives that felt cinematic. What she didn't see at first were the cracks. Henry had already learned how to compartmentalize. Violence in one box, business in another, emotion somewhere else entirely. He knew how to make a woman feel chosen while keeping parts of himself hidden. Karen fell in love with the version of Henry he presented, not the full inventory. They married in 1965. The wedding was traditional enough on the surface. Family present, smiles for photographs. But beneath it, Henry's life didn't slow down. If anything, it accelerated. He brought Karen into a world that rewarded excess. Jewelry appeared without explanation. Cash flowed through the house like water. She quickly learned not to ask too many questions. But questions don't disappear. They wait. Henry liked to describe his marriage as passionate, and it was. Passion fueled by adrenaline often burns hotter. But adrenaline fades, and what remains is character. He cheated early, and often. Mistresses were not rare in that world. They were normalized, almost expected. Men like Henry operated under a warped logic, loyalty to the crew, not necessarily to the spouse. The hierarchy valued silence and profit. Fidelity was secondary. Karen sensed it long before she confirmed it. Late nights, phone calls cut short, the faint scent of perfume that wasn't hers. She confronted him. He denied, then deflected, then exploded. The first time he pushed her during an argument, it wasn't cinematic. It wasn't dramatic. It was quick, a shove born out of frustration. He told himself it wasn't violence, just anger. But anger has gravity. It pulls everything downward. Over time, the push became grabbing. The grabbing became slapping. The slapping became silence afterward. The heavy, suffocating kind where apologies don't fix anything because the pattern has already been established. Karen later disputed the romantic framing of their relationship. She has spoken about the fear, the unpredictability, the nights she waited not knowing whether Henry would come home at all. Henry often framed her as volatile, jealous, emotional. He positioned himself as the calm center of chaos. But that narrative collapses under scrutiny. He was living two lives simultaneously, and two lives require lies. Lies require maintenance. Maintenance requires stress, and stress seeks release. By the early 1970s, Henry's involvement in hijackings and other rackets deepened. The money grew larger, the risks sharper. He began using cocaine more frequently, first socially, then habitually. Cocaine has a specific effect on temperament. It sharpens paranoia, inflates ego, compresses patience. Henry's volatility increased. Karen felt it. Arguments escalated faster. Minor disagreements became explosions. He accused her of questioning him too much. She accused him of disappearing too often. There was a night when she found undeniable proof of another woman. The confrontation that followed was not elegant. It was raw. Karen screamed. Henry shouted louder. The children were asleep down the hall. That detail matters. Domestic abuse rarely happens in isolation. It happens within walls where children are listening. Henry later admitted to being unfaithful. He rarely admitted to the full extent of the abuse. He minimized it, framed it as heated arguments that went too far. But multiple accounts suggest something more sustained. He struck her. He intimidated her. He made her afraid. And then he bought her jewelry. Gifts can function as bandages. They cover wounds without healing them. Karen remained. Not because she was naive, but because she was embedded. The lifestyle had wrapped around her like ivy. The money, the social circle, the normalization of chaos. Leaving would mean dismantling everything. And in that world, leaving isn't simple. There were moments when Karen felt powerful, like the night with the gun. That act wasn't about killing him. It was about reclaiming control, about forcing him to see her pain. Henry interpreted it as passion. He never fully grasped that it was desperation. He often told stories about Karen as if she were enthralled by the gangster lifestyle. And in some ways, she was drawn to the drama. But drama loses its glamour when it becomes routine fear. There were days when Henry didn't come home for 48 hours. Days when Karen didn't know whether he was arrested, injured, or with another woman. She lived inside uncertainty. Uncertainty corrodes trust. Meanwhile, Henry's ego expanded. He liked the attention from other women. He liked being perceived as desirable. It reinforced the illusion that he was powerful. But power without discipline decays. As his drug use increased, so did his unpredictability. Cocaine binges kept him awake for nights at a time. He grew suspicious, irritable, convinced others were plotting. The paranoia of the street merged with the paranoia of addiction. Karen bore the brunt of that volatility. He would storm into the house at odd hours, pacing, ranting about business tensions. She tried to calm him. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it didn't. The children watched. That quiet observation is often overlooked. Children in violent households learn to read tone the way others read books. They sense shifts in air pressure before storms hit. Henry's children learned that early. Henry later tried to present himself as a flawed but loving father. And perhaps he loved his children in his own distorted way. But love is measured by consistency, and he was rarely consistent. There were tender moments, birthday parties, gifts, family dinners where he seemed relaxed. But those moments were islands in a sea of instability. Karen lived in contradiction. She enjoyed the lifestyle's perks while fearing its foundation. She defended Henry publicly while confronting him privately. And Henry leaned into the myth. When Goodfellas was made, their relationship became part of cinematic history. The glamorous gangster couple navigating chaos together. But cinema edits out the repetition, the late-night apologies, the bruises that fade, the trust that erodes slowly, invisibly. Karen has stated that the film softened Henry, that it didn't fully capture the fear, the loneliness. Loneliness inside a marriage can feel like standing in a crowded room where no one hears you. Henry often framed himself as trapped between worlds, loyal to the crew, pressured by the FBI, misunderstood at home. That narrative centers him as victim of circumstance. But accountability matters. He chose the lifestyle. He chose the mistresses. He chose the drugs. He chose the fists. And Karen, for a long time, chose to stay. Why? Because leaving a man like Henry isn't just emotional. It's logistical, financial, dangerous. The mob world doesn't encourage independence. It encourages silence. There were whispers that Karen once considered leaving, that she confided in friends about fear. But fear also includes fear of consequences. Henry's crew valued loyalty. Divorce, especially under tension, can look like vulnerability. Karen balanced survival with hope. Hope that he would stabilize. Hope that the money would keep flowing. Hope that the violence would remain outside the home. Hope is powerful, but hope doesn't stop patterns. By the mid-1970s, Henry's addiction was no longer subtle. Cocaine became daily. His mood swings intensified. He began making reckless business decisions, engaging in drug dealing despite explicit warnings from Paul Vario. Karen saw the unraveling before he did. She saw the late-night pacing, the paranoia, the growing stack of lies. But addiction convinces the addict that everyone else is overreacting. There was a night when Henry struck her hard enough to leave visible marks. She covered them the next day. Long sleeves, sunglasses, familiar tactics in unfamiliar neighborhoods. He apologized afterward. He always apologized. Apologies are easy. Change is not. Karen once said she felt like she was married to two men, the charming provider and the volatile stranger. That duality is common in abusive dynamics. The good version keeps you anchored. The bad version keeps you afraid. Henry didn't wake up one morning intending to become an abuser. He slid into it gradually, just like he slid into crime. Small compromises, small rationalizations, a shove here, a lie there, until the pattern becomes identity. He often blamed stress, the pressure of the street, the need to project strength. But strength doesn't require cruelty at home. The film presents their marriage as complicated but passionate. It underplays the sustained emotional damage. And here's the crucial truth. Karen's experience shaped what would come later. When Henry eventually faced the possibility of flipping, of cooperating with the government, his family was part of that calculation. The instability at home, the growing fear, The realization that the lifestyle was no longer glamorous but dangerous. But we're not there yet. In the 1960s and early 70s, Henry still believed he could balance it all. Violence outside, charm inside, crime in one hand, family in the other. He didn't see the contradiction as fatal. Karen did. Every argument carved distance between them. Every betrayal chipped away at illusion. And every act of violence planted seeds of something that would eventually break their world open. The gun pointed at his forehead that night wasn't just a threat. It was a warning. Not from Karen. From reality. The life he had built was cracking. And the cracks were no longer confined to warehouses and hijacked trucks. They were inside his home. Inside his marriage. And soon, those cracks would widen beyond anything either of them could control. Chapter 6. The drug problem that ruined everything. 1970s. The morning he thought the helicopters were following him, Henry hadn't slept in 3 days. The sky over Brooklyn looked ordinary, pale, washed out, almost peaceful, but Henry's eyes kept snapping upward, searching for movement. A sound, a shadow, the faint chop of rotors that may or may not have been there. He was sitting behind the wheel of his car outside a diner he'd visited 100 times before, fingers tapping against the steering wheel in restless rhythm. Cocaine has a way of convincing you that you're sharper than everyone else, until it convinces you that everyone else is hunting you. In Goodfellas, Henry's descent into drug dealing is fast and frantic. The montage of paranoia, the frantic helicopter shots, the sense that everything collapses in a single manic day. It makes for electric cinema. Reality was slower and more corrosive. Henry had always liked speed. The speed of hijackings. The speed of money changing hands. The speed of adrenaline when something went right. Cocaine didn't feel like a vice at first. It felt like a tool. Long nights at Robert's Lounge required stamina. Meetings bled into early mornings. Jobs required alertness. Cocaine sharpened focus. Heightened confidence. Made him talk faster, think faster, feel invincible. At least in the beginning. The mid-1970s were a transitional period for organized crime in New York. Law enforcement was evolving. Surveillance was becoming more sophisticated. Federal prosecutors were building cases patiently. The old-school mob bosses understood something crucial. Drug trafficking attracted federal attention in a way gambling and hijacking often did not. Drug cases meant longer sentences. Drug cases meant mandatory minimums. Drug cases meant federal heat. Paul Vario had made it clear, no drugs. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a rule. The logic was simple. Hijackings were like shadow businesses. They created profit without triggering the same level of scrutiny. Cocaine, heroin, those substances brought agencies that didn't negotiate. Henry knew the rule, and he broke it anyway. At first, it was small. A connection here. A package there. Something to supplement income. He convinced himself it wasn't serious. That he could manage both worlds. That he was careful enough to avoid detection. But drugs don't stay small. They expand like ink dropped in water. Henry's appetite grew alongside his usage. The lines at parties turned into lines alone in kitchens. The quick bump before a meeting became routine. He began staying awake for days at a time, pacing, talking faster, thinking he was operating at a higher level. To him, it felt like control. To others, it looked like instability. Karen noticed first. The nights grew longer. The mood swings sharper. He became hyper-focused on trivial details, then suddenly distracted by imagined threats. He'd stare out windows, check mirrors repeatedly, snap at her for asking simple questions. Cocaine does something specific to the brain. It amplifies confidence while quietly eroding judgment. It convinces you that your instincts are superior, even as your decision-making deteriorates. Henry believed he was smarter than the system. That belief would become fatal. He began organizing drug deals out of his home. Kitchen tables became staging areas. The suburban house that once symbolized upward mobility turned into a distribution hub. Plastic bags weighed and repackaged. Phone calls made in code that wasn't nearly as sophisticated as he believed. He trusted too easily. He spoke too freely. He operated in ways that felt invisible to him, but obvious to law enforcement. And here's the crucial fracture. Burke and Vario knew. They may not have known every detail at first, but they sensed the shift. Henry's behavior changed. He was less reliable during hijackings, more distracted, less disciplined. Discipline is sacred in organized crime. Cocaine dismantles discipline. There were arguments, quiet ones, subtle warnings. Be careful. Lay low. This isn't smart. Henry interpreted caution as doubt. He interpreted doubt as insult. He felt underestimated. That's the paradox of addiction. It convinces you that the people trying to protect you are actually holding you back. Henry told himself he was expanding, diversifying, building his own revenue stream, not dependent entirely on hijackings, not entirely at the mercy of Burke's decisions. On paper, that sounds strategic. In reality, it was reckless. Drug trafficking is not like hijacking a truck full of clothing. Clothing doesn't testify. Clothing doesn't come with mandatory federal sentencing guidelines. Drugs come with informants, undercover agents, wiretaps. Henry's crew grew more unstable. The men he involved in drug operations weren't always as seasoned. Some were desperate. Some were inexperienced. Cocaine doesn't just draw judgment. It attracts volatility. There were deals that went sideways, money that disappeared, arguments that escalated too quickly. Henry found himself mediating conflicts he had created. His paranoia intensified. The helicopter paranoia wasn't entirely delusion. Law enforcement had begun watching him more closely. But cocaine magnified the fear beyond proportion. Every car parked too long felt like surveillance. Every stranger in a diner felt like an undercover cop. He started carrying more weapons. Not because he needed them, because he was afraid. The crew sensed it. Burke sensed it most of all. Jimmy Burke operated on patience, calculation, low visibility. Henry's drug dealing was like lighting a flare in the middle of a quiet operation. It didn't just risk Henry. It risked everyone connected to him. Burke valued earning. He despised unnecessary attention. And Henry was becoming attention. There were whispers that Burke considered eliminating him, that he discussed whether Henry had become a liability. Those whispers may have been exaggerated later, but the tension was real. Trust in organized crime is fragile. It's built on the assumption that everyone understands risk tolerance. Henry shifted that tolerance unilaterally. He began isolating himself, trusting fewer people. At the same time, he trusted the wrong ones in drug operations. Addiction narrows your world. It shrinks long-term thinking into immediate need. Henry's long-term position within the Lucchese orbit began eroding. Karen saw it clearly. She confronted him repeatedly. The money from drugs was fast, but the stress was relentless. The house felt like it was wired. The phone rang at strange hours. Men came and went with jittery energy. He dismissed her fears. He always did. But inside, he felt the ground shifting. The 1970s were not kind to undisciplined criminals. Federal law enforcement was evolving rapidly. The Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act had been passed earlier in the decade. Prosecutors were learning how to connect dots across cases. Henry wasn't thinking about federal statutes. He was thinking about his next line. There were days when he'd move through his routine with manic efficiency, making calls, arranging deals, checking on hijack operations, and then crash into exhaustion that felt like drowning. The highs got shorter. The paranoia got longer. He began suspecting his own crew of betrayal, accusing associates of skimming money without evidence, raising his voice more frequently, losing the calm he once admired in Burke. That contrast became glaring. Burke remained measured. Henry became erratic. Erratic men are dangerous, not because they're unpredictable to enemies, because they're unpredictable to allies. There was a meeting where Vario reportedly made it clear drugs were not acceptable. It wasn't theatrical. It wasn't a screaming match. It was quiet disappointment. Disappointment cuts deeper than anger. Henry nodded, promised to stop. He didn't. Addiction doesn't negotiate. His circle tightened further. He relied heavily on a few individuals to distribute cocaine. He kept more of the operation within his home. That decision would later prove catastrophic. He felt watched constantly. The helicopter incident became symbolic of his state of mind. He believed federal agents were tracking him in the sky. Sometimes they were. Often they weren't. But perception became indistinguishable from reality. And then came the arrests. It didn't happen in a blaze of gunfire. It happened methodically. Evidence gathered. Informants flipped. Conversations recorded. The web he thought he controlled was actually tightening around him. In 1980, Henry was arrested on drug trafficking charges. The moment the cuffs clicked, something inside him shifted permanently. He had survived previous arrests. Fraud. Minor sentences. Those felt like badges of honor. This felt different. Federal drug charges are not slaps on the wrist. They are walls closing in. Sitting in a holding cell again, older now, sweat drying on his neck, Henry began calculating. Years in prison. Decades even. His drug dealing had not just broken Vario's rule. It had broken the code. In that world, breaking rules invites correction. Correction sometimes means elimination. For the first time, Henry felt genuine fear, not just of law enforcement, but of his own crew. Addiction had led him to gamble with more than money. It had gambled with loyalty. Karen visited him. Her eyes tired. The glamour long gone. She understood the severity before he did. Prison for years. The children growing up without him. The possibility that Burke might not be inclined to protect him this time. Protection is conditional. Henry's drug operation had been selfish. It had exposed the crew. It had violated trust. He began replaying conversations in his head. Burke's tone. Vario's warnings. The quiet distance that had grown between them. Addiction isolates you long before prison does. And in that isolation, Henry faced a question he had never truly considered. Who would protect him now? The man who once admired Jimmy Burke's discipline now feared his calculation. If Henry was a liability, Burke would act. That possibility hovered like a shadow. And for the first time in his life, Henry Hill felt expendable. The drug problem hadn't just ruined his stability. It had destroyed the illusion that he was untouchable. And in the space where that illusion once lived, something else began to grow. Survival instinct. The instinct that would eventually lead him to make the most controversial decision of his life. But that decision was still ahead. For now, he sat in his cell, heart racing, realizing that cocaine had done what law enforcement could not. It had dismantled his standing within the very world he had fought so hard to belong to. And once belonging cracks, everything else follows. Chapter 7. The Lufthansa Heist. Not the Mastermind, 1978. The night before the Lufthansa robbery, Henry Hill barely slept. Not because he was orchestrating a master plan. Not because he was carrying the weight of millions of dollars on his shoulders. But because he knew something enormous was about to happen. And he wasn't in control of it. Goodfellas makes it feel like Henry is central. Like he's standing at the nerve center of the operation, overseeing every moving part. The camera moves with him. The tension builds around him. He narrates it like it's a story. But here's the truth. It wasn't. December 1978. John F. Kennedy International Airport. Lufthansa Cargo Terminal. The heist would become one of the largest cash robberies in American history at the time. Over $5 million in cash. Nearly $1 million in jewelry. It would also become a blood-soaked turning point. And Henry Hill was not the architect. The real force behind the robbery was James Burke. Burke had spent months cultivating relationships at the airport. Air freight handlers. Cargo supervisors. Men who understood the system from the inside. The crucial link was a Lufthansa employee named Louis Werner. Werner had gambling debts. Debts have gravity. In the mob world, gravity pulls you downward until someone decides to exploit your fall. Burke saw opportunity. Henry did not recruit Werner. Henry did not design the blueprint. Henry did not choose the timing. He was involved, yes. Present. Close enough to feel the adrenaline humming in the air. But he was not the mastermind. Burke orchestrated it like a symphony. The planning phase was methodical. Schedules studied. Guard rotations observed. Exit routes mapped. Vehicle selected. Roles assigned. In organized crime, a major robbery isn't chaos. It's logistics. Think of it like moving a piece across a chessboard. Except the piece weighs millions of dollars and the board is federal property. Henry's role was peripheral coordination. He passed information. He facilitated conversations. He connected dots that Burke had already drawn. But he didn't draw the map. The night of the heist was cold. The air biting. The kind of cold that sharpens focus. The crew arrived in vans. Calm. Professional. No screaming. No unnecessary violence. The guards were subdued quickly, restrained. The operation moved with surgical timing. In and out. That part is accurate. What the film doesn't emphasize is how carefully Henry stayed within the lines assigned to him. He wasn't inside the terminal directing men. He wasn't calculating exit strategies. He wasn't managing contingencies. He was not the brain. Burke was. When the news broke the next morning, it rippled through New York like electricity. Headlines screamed. Law enforcement scrambled. The sheer scale stunned everyone. $5 million in 1978 was astronomical. Adjusted for inflation, it would be tens of millions today. The heist felt mythic instantly. Henry felt proud. Pride is intoxicating. Even peripheral involvement in something that large creates a sense of elevation. He told himself he was part of history, that he had helped execute one of the greatest robberies ever pulled off. But even in that moment of pride, a quieter emotion stirred. Fear. Because large crimes create large consequences. Burke understood that immediately. The days following the heist were not celebratory. They were tense. Money had to be distributed carefully. Participants had to stay quiet. No flashy purchases. No sudden lifestyle changes. That was the rule. Some broke it. One associate bought a pink Cadillac for his wife. Another began flashing cash at bars. Burke saw these as leaks in a dam. And Burke did not tolerate leaks. The bodies began appearing quietly. Associates connected to the heist were found dead in cars. In dumpsters. In vacant lots. Not dramatic assassinations. Just sudden absences. The message was clear. Loose ends were being tied. Henry watched this unfold with growing unease. Goodfellas portrays this phase as chaotic but cinematic. Bodies discovered in meat trucks. Music playing in the background. It feels almost darkly comedic. Reality was colder. Each disappearance was a reminder that proximity to big money comes with mortal risk. Burke's paranoia intensified. Not drug-induced paranoia like Henry's, but strategic paranoia. The FBI was watching. Informants were possible. Witnesses were unpredictable. Henry was not on the immediate elimination list. That fact alone reveals something important. If he had been central to the operation, if he had been indispensable, he might have posed a greater threat. Instead, he was adjacent. Useful, but not essential. That distinction likely saved his life. He would later imply that he was deeply involved in the execution, that his fingerprints were all over the planning. But federal case files and testimony suggest otherwise. The strategic meetings were Burke's domain. The pressure calculations were Burke's. Henry participated. He did not command. Still, the heist elevated his perceived status in his own mind. He moved through Robert's lounge with increased swagger. He felt untouchable. But that feeling was a mirage. The Lufthansa robbery marked a shift in the relationship between Henry and Burke. Trust became thinner. Burke saw Henry's drug dealing as instability layered atop a massive federal investigation. The last thing Burke needed was a cocaine-fueled associate drawing attention. Henry sensed the distance. There were fewer casual conversations, more direct instructions, less warmth, if warmth ever truly existed. He began to worry that he knew too much. In organized crime, knowledge is currency. But too much knowledge can make you a liability. The pattern of murders after the heist wasn't random. Burke systematically removed individuals he believed could talk. Whether they had reason to or not didn't matter. Elimination reduces probability. Henry knew that logic intimately. He began imagining scenarios where his name might come up in Burke's calculations. If Henry were arrested on a drug charge, which was becoming increasingly likely, and if he faced decades in prison, would Burke risk him cooperating? That question hung in the air like static. Henry later claimed he flipped because he knew Burke was going to kill him. That claim is plausible, but not fully documented. What is clear is that by the end of 1978, tension between them was palpable. Burke valued discipline. Henry embodied chaos. The Lufthansa money brought temporary wealth, but permanent scrutiny. Federal agents worked tirelessly to unravel the operation. Surveillance increased. Informants were cultivated. Henry's drug operation ran parallel to this storm, amplifying risk. He was juggling explosives, and one was about to detonate. The mythology of the Lufthansa heist casts Henry as a central player in a legendary crime. It elevates him in public imagination. But the deeper truth is more restrained. He was close to greatness, not its architect. He stood near the epicenter of a historic robbery, but he didn't build the epicenter. And as bodies continued to surface and paranoia deepened, Henry began to realize something terrifying. The same man who orchestrated one of the greatest robberies in American history had no hesitation eliminating those who endangered him. Henry's addiction endangered him. Henry's instability endangered him. And in the quiet spaces between meetings, between phone calls, between bursts of bravado, Henry Hill felt something he had never truly felt before. Not fear of prison, not fear of the FBI, fear of his own crew. The Lufthansa heist had brought unimaginable wealth, but it had also tightened the circle, and Henry was standing closer to the edge than he understood. The legend would live forever, but for Henry Hill, the legend was about to become a trap. Chapter 8, The Arrest That Broke Him, 1980. The morning they came for him, Henry Hill was still sweating from the night before. Not from fear, from cocaine. The kitchen table was cluttered with plastic bags, scales, coffee cups half finished, crumbs of powder dusted like snow across a surface that once held family dinners. The house smelled sharp, chemical, stale, restless. Karen was in the bedroom, trying to sleep. The kids were still in their rooms. The sun hadn't fully risen. And then the knock came. Not loud, not violent, just firm. 3 knocks that didn't ask permission. Henry froze for a second. Not because he didn't expect it, but because part of him had started to believe he could outrun it forever. He'd survived fraud arrests, hijacking charges, minor stints. He had maneuvered around consequences his entire adult life. But federal drug charges are different. They don't blink. When he opened the door, he didn't see mob rivals. He didn't see Jimmy Burke. He saw agents. Calm, professional, efficient. No shouting, no dramatics. They knew exactly what they were there for. They'd been watching him for months. The kitchen that felt invisible to Henry had not been invisible at all. In Goodfellas, this moment is manic. Helicopters overhead. Sauce cooking on the stove. Henry running through errands in a frenzy. The day feels chaotic, almost comedic. Reality was colder. The arrest didn't happen in a blur of cinematic noise. It happened in clarity. He was charged with drug trafficking, possession with intent to distribute. Not a small-time bust. Not a slap on the wrist. Federal cocaine charges carried serious time. Decades were possible. As they read him his rights, Henry's mind did not race to the FBI. It raced to Jimmy Burke. Because in that world, being arrested wasn't just a legal problem. It was a loyalty test. The ride to the holding facility felt longer than it was. Henry stared out the window, watching neighborhoods pass by. He had moved through those streets with confidence for years. Now they looked different, distant, unreachable. Addiction had led him here. But addiction was only part of it. Arrogance had played its role too. He had believed he was too embedded to fall. He had believed that proximity to Burke and Vario shielded him. But proximity is not immunity. Sitting in the holding cell, the weight of the situation pressed down slowly. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Other inmates shifted on benches. But Henry felt alone. He began calculating. Federal sentencing guidelines were not vague suggestions. They were structured, cold, mathematical. Drug quantity translated directly into years. Years translated into absence. Absence translated into vulnerability. He had a wife, children, and enemies. Karen arrived later, eyes red but composed. She had known this was coming long before he admitted it. She didn't scream. She didn't accuse. She just looked at him, and in that look was exhaustion. "You said you had it under control," she told him quietly. Control had been the illusion. Now came the fear. And the fear wasn't a prison food or metal bars. It was of what prison meant in mob arithmetic. A man facing decades as leverage. Leverage creates risk, and risk is eliminated. Henry began thinking about the Lufthansa heist, about the men who had vanished quietly afterward, about the way Burke handled loose ends. He knew things. Not everything, but enough. Enough to be dangerous if pressured. The crew would understand that. And if they understood that, what would they do? He had broken Vario's rule. Drugs were forbidden precisely because they brought federal heat. Now he was the embodiment of that heat. Protection in organized crime is conditional. It is extended as long as you are useful and manageable. Henry was now unpredictable. In jail, rumors move quickly. Whispers about possible cooperation, about what sentences could be reduced if testimony is offered. He hadn't flipped yet, but the possibility existed, and that possibility alone could mark him. Burke did not visit immediately. That silence spoke louder than words. When contact finally came, it was indirect, through intermediaries. Casual inquiries about how Henry was holding up, subtle reminders of loyalty. But Henry heard something beneath the surface. Distance. He replayed scenarios in his head. If he refused to cooperate and went to prison for decades, what would happen to Karen? To the children? Would the crew support them financially? Maybe. For a while. But mob support is not guaranteed indefinitely. If he cooperated, what would happen? In that world, cooperating was treason. But treason against whom? Against men who might already be weighing his removal? Henry's survival instinct began to surface in ways it never had before. He had lived recklessly for years, assuming the crew was his safety net. Now he questioned whether the net had holes. The prosecutors laid out the case clearly. Wiretaps, surveillance, informants. They weren't bluffing. The evidence was strong. They also made something else clear. If he cooperated, his sentence could shrink dramatically. Witness protection was an option. New identity, new life. The suggestion sounded absurd at first. Henry Hill, abandoning the mob? Unthinkable. But prison for decades was equally unthinkable. And then there was the other possibility. What if Burke decided prison wasn't enough? What if Henry was silenced before he could even consider cooperation? The paranoia that cocaine had cultivated now mixed with rational fear. He remembered the bodies after Lufthansa. Men who had been closer to Burke than he was. Men who had earned more. Men who still disappeared. He wasn't the most valuable asset in the crew. He was the most unstable. And unstable pieces are removed from boards. Karen began pushing him toward cooperation. She feared prison. She feared retaliation. She feared everything collapsing completely. She had lived through the volatility of his addiction. Now she saw the final consequence. Henry resisted at first. Loyalty had been his identity since adolescence. To flip would be to erase that identity. But what had loyalty given him recently? Silence. Distance. Fear. There were nights in jail where he lay awake replaying conversations with Burke, trying to decipher tone, trying to read between lines that may not have existed. He imagined scenarios where a hit was ordered quietly, a staged accident, a jailhouse assault. Paranoia is contagious. But this time, paranoia wasn't entirely drug-induced. It was grounded in precedent. The prosecutors sensed his internal conflict. They applied pressure patiently. They knew time was on their side. Henry's lawyer outlined the numbers. Potential decades. Reduced time with cooperation. Decades meant his children growing up without him. Reduced time meant possibility. The word possibility began to outweigh the word loyalty. And that shift marked the true break. When Henry finally agreed to talk seriously with federal authorities, it wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a cinematic confession. It was quiet. A conversation in a sterile room. He began describing operations. Names. Roles. He told himself he was protecting his family. He told himself Burke would have done the same if roles were reversed. That last thought was a lie. Burke would not have flipped. But Burke also wasn't facing the same equation. Henry had built his identity around being close to power. Now he was choosing survival over belonging. That choice fractured something fundamental. The decision to cooperate wasn't instant. It was gradual. Each meeting with prosecutors made the next easier. Each detail shared made retreat harder. Once he started speaking, silence becomes impossible. When word eventually spread through the underworld that Henry Hill was cooperating, the reaction was immediate. Shock, anger, validation of suspicion. The associate who had once felt untouchable became the rat. The man who idolized mobsters from across the street had now betrayed the very code he worshipped. But from Henry's perspective, betrayal had already happened. He believed he had been left exposed. He believed Burke had distanced himself deliberately. Whether that perception was fully accurate or partially constructed doesn't matter as much as this. Henry believed it, and belief drives action. The arrest in 1980 didn't just put him in handcuffs. It shattered the illusion that he was protected. It forced him to confront a hierarchy where he was always expendable. It stripped away the fantasy of being treated like family. He was not family. He was leverage, and leverage cuts both ways. As he signed cooperation agreements, as he prepared to testify, as he accepted the inevitability of witness protection, Henry Hill crossed a line he could never uncross. He was no longer an associate orbiting power. He was an informant. And in that world, informants do not age gracefully. The arrest had broken more than his routine. It had broken his identity. And from that fracture would emerge the public version of Henry Hill, the narrator, the storyteller, the man who would shape his own myth. But first, he would have to survive the fallout. And survival in the aftermath of betrayal is rarely simple. The real consequences were only beginning. Chapter 9. Becoming a Government Witness, 1980 to 1982. The first time Henry Hill walked into a federal building not in handcuffs, but as an asset, he felt smaller than he ever had in jail. There were no mob associates waiting in the lobby, no nods of respect, no coded conversations, just beige walls, fluorescent lights, and a receptionist who didn't know his name meant anything to anyone. He wasn't a gangster in that room. He was inventory. The prosecutors didn't greet him like a hero. They greeted him like a tool. They had files spread across a table, transcripts, surveillance reports, financial records. They already knew more than he expected. They didn't need him for everything. They needed him to connect dots. And connecting dots is not glamorous. It's methodical. Goodfellas presents Henry's cooperation almost like the final act of a tragic opera. The mob closes in. The government offers salvation. He flips to save his life. The scene feels climactic. But real cooperation is less cinematic and more clinical. The first sessions were cautious. He didn't spill everything immediately. He tested them, offered small confirmations, watched their reactions. Prosecutors do the same. They test informants for credibility, for consistency. Henry quickly learned something uncomfortable. The government didn't trust him. They listened carefully. They cross-checked every detail. They compared his version of events against wiretaps and witness statements. When something didn't line up, they didn't shout. They paused. They circled back. They let silence do the pressure. Henry had built his life around shaping perception. Now he was in a room where facts mattered more than performance. He began describing hijackings, the structure of the Lucchese family, the way money flowed from associates up through capos. He explained roles, routines, rituals. Some of what he said was accurate. Some of it was embellished. That tendency would follow him for the rest of his life. Prosecutors noted it early. He had a habit of inserting himself deeper into operations than records suggested. He would say, "We decided," when evidence showed someone else decided. He would describe himself as central when he was peripheral. That doesn't mean he was useless. It means he required verification. To the FBI and federal prosecutors, Henry was valuable precisely because he was mid-level. He wasn't a boss. He wasn't insulated by layers of deniability. He was close enough to operations to understand mechanics, but low enough to know the vulnerabilities. He testified about Paul Vario, about James Burke, about the structure of the crew. He explained the logic behind hijackings, how stolen goods were fenced, how tribute worked. To a jury unfamiliar with mob culture, his testimony sounded authoritative. Inside the courtroom, he felt something strange. He had once feared these rooms. Now he commanded them. But command built on betrayal is unstable. As he spoke about Vario and Burke, he wasn't just recounting crimes. He was dismantling the very hierarchy he once worshipped. Each name he uttered carried weight. Each detail was a nail. And yet, even as he testified, contradictions slipped in. He sometimes claimed knowledge of murders he had only heard about secondhand. He described dynamics that made him appear closer to the center than he had been. He blurred the lines between witness and participant. Prosecutors adjusted. They learned to frame his testimony carefully, to avoid over-reliance on his most dramatic claims. They corroborated with independent evidence wherever possible. Henry's reliability wasn't perfect, but it was sufficient. In 1981 and 1982, his cooperation helped secure convictions against key figures. Paul Vario was convicted and sentenced to prison. Burke would also face significant charges. Henry watched the trials unfold with mixed emotion. On one level, he felt vindicated. These men had allowed him to spiral. They had distanced themselves when he was arrested. They had considered him expendable. On another level, he felt exposed. There is no halfway point in cooperation. Once you testify, you cannot return. The mob world branded him immediately. Rat, snitch, traitor. Those labels carry permanence. Witness protection was presented as a solution, a new identity, relocation, safety. But safety comes at a cost. He and Karen were relocated under federal supervision. New names, new addresses, different states, different routines. Their children were forced into unfamiliar schools with fabricated backstories. Henry struggled with the anonymity. For years, he had thrived on recognition. The nods in restaurants, the deference of bars. In witness protection, he was nobody. Nobody is safe, but nobody is also invisible. He missed the structure of the mob world, the hierarchy, the rhythm, the coded language. Witness protection doesn't provide community. It provides insulation. He also struggled with obedience. Federal marshals have rules. Strict ones. No contact with former associates. No returning to old neighborhoods. No criminal activity. Rules had always been negotiable in his previous life. Now they were enforced. He began pushing boundaries quickly. Small violations at first. Casual comments in public. Drinking too heavily. Revealing too much to new acquaintances. The impulse to be recognized remained. He gave interviews occasionally, testing how far he could stretch the leash. Karen adapted more cautiously. She understood the fragility of their situation. But Henry resented the confinement. He had betrayed powerful men to save himself. And now he felt caged anyway. The prosecutors who once met with him regularly moved on to new cases. Their focus shifted. Henry was no longer central. He had served his function. That realization stung. He had imagined cooperation would grant him a new kind of significance. Instead, it made him a footnote in larger federal victories. There were also moments of self-doubt. Late at night, in unfamiliar houses with unfamiliar neighbors, he would replay courtroom testimony in his head, wondering whether he had exaggerated too much, whether he had overstepped. But those doubts rarely lasted long. He leaned into the narrative that he had done what he had to do. That survival justified betrayal. Karen reinforced that logic. She reminded him of the years he might have spent in prison, of the children growing up without him. Survival is persuasive, but survival also isolates. Former associates despised him. The mob community that once embraced him erased him. The government tolerated him. That left Henry alone with his own story, and he began shaping it. He talked more openly about his past, shared details with journalists under careful supervision. He realized something important. People were fascinated. The public loved insider stories. The mystique of the Mafia had captured imagination for decades. And here he was, a man who could narrate it from the inside. The temptation to embellish grew. Each retelling made him slightly more central, slightly braver, slightly more integral. Memory bends under attention. The more he told the story, the more it evolved. But inside the legal framework, prosecutors were careful. They knew his credibility had limits. They never relied solely on his word for uncorroborated murders. They cross-referenced everything. His cooperation achieved its primary goal: reduced sentence, protection. but it also cemented his identity permanently. He was no longer Henry Hill, associate. He was Henry Hill, informant. That label followed him even into anonymity. Witness protection did not grant peace. It granted survival. And survival without belonging feels hollow. There were whispers within the program that he might be expelled if he violated rules. And he did violate them. Multiple times. Drug use resumed. Minor arrests occurred. He revealed his identity to strangers during drunken nights. He couldn't fully let go of who he had been. And who he had been was built on storytelling. As 1982 closed, Henry's transformation was complete. He had crossed from participant to witness, from enforcer to narrator. But narration carries its own power, and Henry was just beginning to understand how to wield it. The government had used him to dismantle parts of the Lucchese structure. Soon, he would use the government's validation to construct a new identity, not as a criminal, not as a victim, but as a storyteller. And storytellers have freedom criminals do not. The problem is this: when your survival depends on your version of events, the truth becomes flexible. And Henry Hill was about to discover just how profitable flexibility could be. Chapter 10: Witness Protection. The Life He Couldn't Live, 1982, late 1980s. The first morning he woke up under a different name. Henry Hill walked to the bathroom mirror and stared at his own face like it belonged to someone else. The federal marshals had handed him paperwork the night before. A new identity, a new social security number, a new story. He was supposed to memorize it like a script. Birthplace, work history, family background. Everything clean. Everything ordinary. Ordinary. That word felt heavier than prison. For a man who had built his entire sense of self around being recognized, feared, respected, envied, ordinary was suffocating. Witness protection promised safety. It did not promise comfort. They moved him and Karen to a quiet suburb far from New York. Different accents, different weather. Neighbors who didn't ask many questions because most people don't. That anonymity, at first, felt almost peaceful. No late-night knocks from associates. No coded calls. No paranoia about being followed by rivals. But safety has a strange aftertaste when it comes to the cost of identity. Henry had once walked into restaurants and watched heads turn. He had once ordered drinks without paying. He had once carried himself like someone who owned space. Now he stood in grocery store lines unnoticed. It wasn't the loss of crime that unsettled him. It was the loss of status. The Witness Security Program, known as WITSEC, operates with rigid rules. No contact with former associates. No returning to old neighborhoods. No revealing past identity. Maintain employment. Avoid illegal activity. Stay quiet. Quiet was never Henry's strength. At first, he tried. He took small jobs. Construction work. Short-term employment arranged through program assistants. He dressed down. Kept his head low. Memorized his new name until it rolled off his tongue naturally. But the habits of a lifetime don't evaporate overnight. He missed the rhythm of criminal life. Not necessarily the danger, but the structure, the coded language, the feeling of belonging to something secret. Ordinary people talk about weather. Mob associates talk about leverage. Henry felt like he had been dropped into a foreign country where no one spoke his language. Karen adjusted more cautiously. She understood the stakes. She saw witness protection as survival, stability, a chance to raise their children without constant fear of retaliation. Henry saw it as exile. There were moments of calm, family dinners without paranoia, school events without scanning the crowd for threats. But calm felt empty to him. He had spent decades operating at high intensity. The silence was deafening. And then came the drinking. Alcohol had always been present in his life, but now it filled the vacuum left by adrenaline. He began spending nights at local bars, careful not to reveal too much, but incapable of fully restraining himself. People are curious by nature. A man who carries himself like he once commanded something larger draws questions. Henry would test the edges. Small hints at first. I used to know some guys back east. I've seen things you wouldn't believe. The marshals warned him repeatedly. He promised to behave. He rarely did. The program relocated him multiple times because of rule violations. He revealed too much. made acquaintances he shouldn't have, let his ego override caution. Witness protection is built on invisibility. Henry craved visibility. That contradiction made him unstable within the program. He also struggled financially. The government provides assistance during transition, but it is not luxurious. It is designed for safety, not indulgence. The days of envelopes stuffed with cash were gone. He had a budget. Budgeting felt humiliating. He blamed the government for not providing enough. He blamed Karen for pushing him to cooperate. He rarely blamed himself. Cocaine returned to his life sooner than it should have. Addiction had not been cured by cooperation. It had merely been paused. The same restlessness that drove him into drug trafficking resurfaced in quiet suburban streets. He began dealing again, on a smaller scale. That decision was reckless beyond measure. He had flipped to avoid prison for drug charges, and now he was re-entering the same risk environment. Addiction does not learn from logic. It learns from craving. His drug activity led to new arrests in the mid-1980s. Not massive federal indictments like before, but enough to raise alarms within WITSEC. The marshals were furious. The program depends on participants not drawing attention. Henry was a magnet for attention. Each arrest risked exposure of his identity. Each violation chipped away at federal patience. Karen felt trapped again. She had believed witness protection would mean safety. Instead, she found herself navigating another unstable version of Henry. The volatility remained. The drinking intensified. The resentment grew. He resented anonymity. He resented discipline. He resented the fact that he was no longer important. The irony is sharp. He had betrayed powerful men to avoid becoming irrelevant in prison. And now he felt irrelevant in suburbia. There were nights he would sit alone and replay stories from his mob days, telling them to strangers in fragments. The more he told them, the more he refined them. Details sharpened. Scenes dramatized. His role elevated slightly with each retelling. Memory is elastic when it's rehearsed often. In 1985, he was arrested again for drug-related charges. That arrest triggered serious consequences within witness protection. He was eventually expelled from the program after repeated violations. Expulsion meant losing federal support, losing relocation assistance, losing the structured safety net he had been given. He had been granted a rare second chance, and he squandered it. Without WITSEC's oversight, he drifted more openly. He moved between states, took odd jobs, leaned more heavily into telling his story publicly. This is where transformation begins. Henry realized something crucial. He may not have been able to remain a gangster, but he could become an insider narrator. Journalists were fascinated by former mob associates willing to talk. The public appetite for organized crime stories was enormous. Films, books, documentaries. The cultural mystique of the Mafia was booming. He connected with author Nicholas Pileggi during this period. Pileggi was a seasoned crime reporter. He knew how to filter bravado from fact. He listened carefully, asked pointed questions, cross-checked details. The collaboration would eventually become the book, Wise Guy. But even in those early conversations, Henry's storytelling instincts were visible. He leaned into drama. He framed himself as central. He emphasized his proximity to power. Pileggi corroborated extensively. He didn't take Henry's word at face value. He compared accounts with other sources, court transcripts, law enforcement records. What emerged was a narrative shaped by both memory and verification. But Henry's impulse to exaggerate never fully disappeared. Witness protection had failed him not because it was flawed, but because he could not live quietly. He had been built for noise. The suburban houses, the new names, the blank slates, they felt like erasure. An erasure frightened him more than prison ever had. He often told friends later that he missed the old life. Not the danger exactly, but the intensity, the certainty of his role. In the mob world, he knew where he stood. In witness protection, he didn't. That ambiguity destabilized him. His marriage deteriorated further during these years. Karen had endured mob volatility. Now she endured post-mob resentment. The promise of safety had not translated into peace. They argued frequently. Money was tight. Trust was thinner. Henry blamed everyone except himself for the instability. He blamed the government for limiting him. He blamed former associates for abandoning him. He blamed fate. Rarely did he accept that addiction and ego had created this pattern. By the late 1980s, Henry Hill was no longer under federal protection. He was adrift. He had burned bridges with the mob. He had strained patience with the government. He had destabilized his family. What remained was his story, and he began to understand its value. Because while he couldn't live quietly as an anonymous citizen, he could live loudly as a former insider. Witness protection had failed to contain him, but it had preserved him long enough to reinvent himself. The problem is this: reinvention requires a stable foundation, and Henry's foundation was built on shifting truth. The life he couldn't live quietly would soon become the life he would sell loudly. And once you start selling your own legend, the temptation to reshape it becomes irresistible. Chapter 11. Selling the Story. Wise Guy and the Birth of a Myth. Late 1980s, 1990. The first time he realized people were leaning in instead of pulling away, Henry Hill felt powerful again. Not because he had money, not because he had a crew behind him, but because he had a story. It was the late 1980s. He was no longer protected by the federal program, no longer orbiting Jimmy Burke, no longer standing in courtrooms as a cooperating witness. He was something else now, a man with access to secrets the public desperately wanted. Organized crime had always fascinated America. The mystique, the code of silence, the violence wrapped in ritual. But what the public rarely had was a narrator willing to walk them through it from the inside. Henry was willing, and more importantly, he needed to be. He was financially unstable. His marriage was fractured. His reputation in the underworld was radioactive. The only currency he had left was memory. That's when he began working closely with Nicholas Pileggi. Pileggi wasn't naive. He had spent years covering organized crime for major publications. He knew that mob associates exaggerate. He knew that memory bends under ego. But he also knew that first-person accounts carry electricity. The early interviews were long, hours at a time. Henry would talk rapidly, sometimes jumping between decades mid-sentence. He described the smell of the cab stand in Brooklyn, the rhythm of hijackings, the unspoken hierarchy inside Robert's lounge. Pileggi listened, and then he cross-checked. He compared Henry's accounts with court transcripts, FBI reports, other informants. He verified what he could. Where facts aligned, he leaned in. Where they didn't, he adjusted. What emerged was Wise Guy. But here's the tension. Wise Guy was built from Henry's voice, and Henry's voice was not neutral. He positioned himself as central to key moments, as indispensable in operations, as emotionally conflicted rather than purely opportunistic. The narrative framed him as a man swept up by culture, as much participant as observer. It made him human. It also made him compelling. And compelling sells. Henry embraced that framing quickly. He liked the way it felt to be portrayed as the insider who saw it all, the man who could explain the Mafia's code to ordinary readers. But something subtle happened during that process. The more he told the story, the more it crystallized into a version that favored him. He emphasized his early admiration for mobsters, the innocent kid across for the cab stand. He framed his involvement as gradual, almost inevitable. He described his violence as circumstantial, rarely gratuitous. He downplayed the domestic abuse, the volatility, the selfishness. He rarely lingered on his own cruelty. Instead, he leaned into the allure of the lifestyle, the suits, the cash, the swagger. He described Jimmy Burke as calculating but magnetic, Paul Vario as powerful but distant. He cast himself somewhere in between, the relatable bridge between audience and underworld. Wise Guy was a success. And then came the film adaptation. When Martin Scorsese turned Wise Guy into Goodfellas in 1990, the transformation became permanent. Cinema amplifies myth. Ray Liotta's portrayal of Henry Hill was charismatic, sharp, observant. A man both participant and commentator. The film didn't erase his crimes. It showed them, but it wrapped them in pace and energy that made the experience intoxicating. Henry watched himself become a character, and he loved it. Premieres, interviews, attention. For the first time since leaving witness protection, he felt recognized again. People approach him differently, not as a disgraced informant, not as a washed-up associate, but as the real-life inspiration behind a cultural phenomenon. He leaned into it. He began giving more interviews, appearing on talk shows, sharing behind-the-scenes stories. Each appearance brought small checks, applause, validation. He rarely corrected exaggerations. If anything, he expanded them. He would hint at deeper involvement in certain crimes than evidence suggested. He would imply knowledge of murders he had only heard about indirectly. He would describe himself as more central to the Lufthansa planning than records confirmed. Why? Because audiences prefer protagonists, and Henry understood narrative instinctively. He framed his betrayal not as cowardice, but as survival. He portrayed his cooperation as forced by imminent danger. He suggested that Jimmy Burke had already marked him for death. That claim may contain elements of truth, but it also conveniently positions Henry as reacting rather than initiating. He was shaping his own mythology in real time. The success of Goodfellas created something unexpected. Sympathy. Viewers saw Henry as flawed, but relatable. Ambitious. Seduced by lifestyle. Ultimately human. That sympathy obscured uncomfortable truths. His sustained drug dealing despite warnings. His domestic abuse. His repeated violations of witness protection rules. His continued arrests, even after flipping. Those details didn't vanish. They just faded behind cinematic glow. Henry didn't correct that fade. He benefited from it. There were moments when journalists pressed him harder, asked about inconsistencies in his testimony, questioned the shifting details between interviews. He deflected skillfully. Memory is imperfect, he would say. Time blurs edges. That explanation works until patterns emerge. The pattern was this. In each retelling, Henry's role edged closer to the center. Not dramatically, but incrementally. He never claimed to be the boss, but he nudged himself closer to strategic conversations. He never claimed to be a prolific killer, but he suggested deeper knowledge than documented. He walked a line between confession and performance. Karen's perspective during this period was more reserved. She participated in some interviews, but she later disputed aspects of his portrayal. She has indicated that the romantic framing of their relationship softened realities. Henry rarely engaged deeply with those disputes publicly. He preferred the spotlight. The film turned him into a cultural artifact. But artifacts don't age gracefully when the creator is still alive. He began capitalizing on the association. Paid appearances at clubs, Mafia-themed events, autograph signings. The irony is staggering. A man who had flipped on a mob was now profiting from mob mythology. Some former associates were furious. Others were silent. But none forgot. Henry presented himself as the insider who had survived. But survival built on betrayal creates a hollow victory. Behind the interviews and the applause, his personal life remained unstable. Drinking intensified. Cocaine returned intermittently. Arrests continued sporadically through the 1990s. The myth grew stronger as the man grew weaker. There is a psychological effect that comes from watching your life dramatized on screen. You begin remembering scenes the way they were filmed, not the way they occurred. Henry occasionally blurred that line in interviews. He would describe moments in language suspiciously similar to the movie's pacing. He wasn't necessarily lying deliberately every time, but he was adapting memory to narrative. And narrative is seductive. The success of Wise Guy and Goodfellas gave Henry something he had always craved. Recognition. He was no longer invisible, but recognition built on curated truth is fragile. He was now locked into a role, the charming informant, the insider narrator, the flawed antihero. That role paid, but also trapped him, because once the public accepts a version of you, deviating from it becomes risky. Henry leaned further into performance. He told the stories louder. He laughed at moments that weren't funny in real life. He presented violence as anecdote. The deeper moral weight of his actions faded behind entertainment. But beneath the myth, the facts remained. He had never been a made man. He had never been the mastermind. He had never been as central as the film suggested. He had been useful. He had been opportunistic. He had been reckless. And now he was profitable. The transformation from criminal to cultural icon happened gradually, then all at once. But icons are projections, and projections distort. As the 1990s began, Henry Hill stood at a strange intersection. He had betrayed the mob. He had outlived many former associates. He had survived prison. He had survived witness protection. And now he was being celebrated for the very world he had dismantled. The question lingered quietly beneath the applause. Who was Henry Hill without the story? And what happens when the story becomes more important than the truth? That answer would unfold in the years to come. Because myths can sustain you, but they can also consume you. Chapter 12. The Lies Begin to Unravel, 1990s. The first time someone publicly questioned his story, Henry Hill laughed it off. He was sitting under bright studio lights, promoting yet another interview tied to the success of Goodfellas. The audience was warm. The host was smiling. The narrative felt polished. But then came the question, subtle, almost polite. Some former associates say you exaggerated your role in certain operations. How do you respond to that? Henry leaned back, smirked, and said something smooth, something dismissive, something about jealousy, about how people like to rewrite history when they're not the ones in the spotlight. The audience laughed, but beneath that laughter, something uncomfortable had begun. The myth he had helped construct was now being measured against documentation. And documentation does not laugh. Throughout the early 1990s, as Goodfellas cemented itself as one of the most iconic crime films ever made, Henry's visibility increased. Interviews multiplied, book signings, club appearances, paid speaking engagements. He became a living footnote to cinematic history. But visibility invites scrutiny. Journalists began revisiting court transcripts, FBI records, testimonies from other informants. The details were there, dry, unemotional, precise. And when those details were compared to Henry's evolving interviews, small fractures appeared. He sometimes described himself as more deeply involved in the Lufthansa planning than evidence suggested. Records placed James Burke at the center of the operation strategy. Henry had passed information and facilitated conversations, yes, but he had not orchestrated it. Yet in some interviews, Henry's phrasing shifted subtly. We planned it. We decided. We knew exactly what to do. The language expanded his proximity. He occasionally claimed knowledge of specific murders he had not directly witnessed. He would recount conversations as if he had been in the room, when in reality, he had heard about them later. Those who had actually been present contradicted his placement. Were these deliberate lies? Or the natural inflation of ego under spotlight? The answer is not always binary, but the pattern was consistent. Henry gravitated toward the center of his own legend. In quieter moments, former associates who had survived the legal storms spoke to journalists off the record. They described Henry as useful, yes, involved, yes, but not indispensable. Not strategic command, not a mastermind. One former associate reportedly described him as a guy who hung around powerful people and thought it made him powerful. That assessment cuts deep. Henry never responded publicly to that specific remark, but his later interviews grew more defensive. He emphasized that without him, certain prosecutions would not have happened, that he had insider access no one else did. That part was true. He had cooperated significantly, but cooperation does not equate to centrality in crime. His relationship with Nicholas Pileggi also evolved during this period. Pileggi stood by the book. Wise Guy had been carefully researched. It did not present Henry as the boss. It presented him as a mid-level associate navigating a violent ecosystem. But Henry's public retellings sometimes edged beyond the book's boundaries. Memory and performance began blending. The problem with retelling the same story repeatedly is that repetition reshapes recollection. You begin remembering the way you told it last time, not the way it occurred. Henry was telling his story constantly. Nightclubs, radio shows, late-night television, even casual conversations at bars. The more he spoke, the more the story gained cinematic pacing. He would pause at dramatic moments, Lower his voice. Lean into suspense. He understood audience rhythm instinctively. But audiences rarely cross-check details. Journalists do. In the mid-1990s, several investigative pieces revisited aspects of his testimony. They noted inconsistencies in timelines, slight shifts in who was present during specific events, minor discrepancies in amounts of money described. None of these inconsistencies alone dismantled his credibility, but cumulatively, they created doubt, and doubt spreads quietly. Karen's voice during this period became more distinct. She gave interviews of her own, sometimes contradicting Henry's portrayal of their marriage. She disputed the romantic framing. She spoke about fear, about instability, about addiction. Henry downplayed those accounts. He suggested she remembered things differently because of emotion. Emotion is often dismissed when it contradicts narrative, but emotion carries truth of its own. His children grew older. They watched their father become a public figure tied to organized crime. The family had endured witness protection, relocations, instability. Now they faced the strange reality of their past being entertainment. Henry did not always handle that complexity with care. He sometimes treated his story as separate from its impact on them. The tension between myth and reality intensified. There were interviews where Henry would contradict himself within the same conversation. A detail about who drove a car during a robbery. A description of how close he stood to a specific figure. A claim about who made a decision. These were not grand fabrications. They were incremental shifts. But incremental shifts accumulate. Law enforcement officials who had worked with him maintained that while he had been useful and largely truthful during formal testimony, his later public storytelling contained embellishments. One retired agent reportedly remarked that Henry liked the spotlight too much to keep the edges clean. That statement captures something essential. Spotlight encourages performance. Performance encourages exaggeration. Henry was not unique in this tendency. Many former criminals who enter media cycles reshape their past for effect. But Henry's case was amplified by the success of Goodfellas. He wasn't just another former mob associate. He was the one people recognized, the one whose voice narrated a cultural milestone. That recognition became addictive in its own right. As his substance abuse continued intermittently through the 1990s, the line between memory distortion and conscious embellishment blurred further. Alcohol affects recall. Cocaine affects perception. Combined with ego, they create unreliable storytelling. He would occasionally contradict previous statements in ways that puzzled interviewers. When confronted, he'd shrug. It was a long time ago. Time does erode memory, but it doesn't selectively elevate one's importance. The more scrutiny increased, the more defensive he became. He accused critics of jealousy, of protecting mob reputations, of misunderstanding how things really worked. That defensive posture reinforced skepticism, because the stronger the defense, the louder the underlying doubt. By the late 1990s, Henry Hill had become both a celebrated insider and a controversial narrator. His image remained charismatic. His stories remained compelling, but cracks were visible. He had positioned himself as the ultimate authority on his own past. Authority requires consistency. Consistency was slipping. There were also financial pressures. Appearance fees fluctuated. Media interest rose and fell. He sometimes accepted smaller engagements to maintain relevance. Relevance became currency. And when relevance dips, storytellers intensify. He began leaning more heavily into darker anecdotes, hinting at secrets he hadn't revealed yet, suggesting deeper knowledge without fully articulating it. Teasing mystery keeps audiences engaged, but it also invites investigation. The unraveling was not explosive. It was gradual. A raised eyebrow in a magazine profile. A footnote in an investigative piece. A former associate disputing a detail. Each instance alone was minor. Together, they formed a pattern. Henry Hill had always been a man chasing proximity to power. Now he chased proximity to myth. But myth is fragile when built on flexible truth. As the 1990s drew toward their close, his public persona remained intact, but the foundation was less stable than it appeared. Because once doubt enters narrative, it lingers. And Henry Hill's story, once accepted as insider gospel, was beginning to face a question he had long avoided. How much of it was exactly as he said? And how much had been polished, expanded, reshaped, not to deceive necessarily, but to elevate? The answer would not arrive in a single revelation. It would seep in slowly, just as the myth had been built slowly. And as the years moved forward, the distance between the legend and the man would grow harder to ignore. Chapter 13: Arrests, Addiction, and the Collapse of the Myth, 1990s, 2000s. The mugshot didn't look like Ray Liotta. It didn't look like the sharp-suited narrator gliding through Copacabana kitchens or leaning against a Cadillac with easy confidence. It looked tired, bloated, eyes dulled by something heavier than nostalgia. By the mid-1990s, Henry Hill was no longer the freshly minted insider celebrity riding the momentum of Goodfellas. The book had sold. The movie had become iconic. The interviews had multiplied. But addiction does not retire when the credits roll. It waits. Henry's drinking intensified through the 90s. Cocaine re-entered his life in cycles. There would be stretches of public sobriety, followed by relapses that quietly unraveled whatever stability he had managed to construct. He had already been expelled from witness protection years earlier, due to repeated violations and arrests. Without the structure of federal oversight, his boundaries dissolved further. In 1985, he had been arrested for narcotics possession again, even after cooperating with the government. That arrest had shocked some who believed flipping meant reform. It didn't. It meant survival. By the 1990s, smaller arrests punctuated his life: disorderly conduct, alcohol-related incidents, minor drug issues. None of them individually dramatic. But together they painted a pattern. The man who once claimed he had outsmarted the system now looked like he couldn't manage himself. He continued to give interviews, but the tone shifted subtly. Early interviews carried sharp recall and calculated pacing. Later ones drifted. He repeated anecdotes, occasionally contradicted earlier statements, sometimes laughed at moments that no longer felt humorous. There is a difference between telling a story and living inside one. Henry was living inside his own myth. And myths don't age well when the protagonist is still deteriorating. Financial instability worsened. The appearance fees that once flowed steadily became sporadic. Pop culture moves quickly. New stories replace old ones. The public's appetite for Mafia nostalgia ebbs and flows. Henry tried to stay relevant. He appeared at Mafia-themed events, signed autographs in smoky banquet halls, posed for photos with fans who saw him as a symbol of cinematic history. But behind the handshakes and forced smiles, the reality was harsher. He struggled with consistent employment. The discipline required for ordinary work still clashed with his personality. He felt underutilized in jobs that didn't acknowledge his notoriety. He began leaning more heavily on the only asset he believed he had left: his story. But the more he told it, the more it frayed. Journalists noticed inconsistencies. Dates shifted. Roles expanded. In one interview, he would downplay his involvement in a violent act. In another, he would suggest deeper knowledge of it. When pressed, he often deflected with humor or vague memory disclaimers. "I was there, but I wasn't there," he once said about a specific incident. That ambiguity may have felt clever in the moment, but it chipped at credibility. Meanwhile, his relationship with Karen continued to deteriorate. Years of instability had eroded trust beyond repair. They separated. The marriage that once symbolized glamour had become collateral damage. Karen, in her own interviews, painted a more somber picture of their life. She spoke about fear, about emotional volatility, about the difficulty of raising children in the shadow of notoriety. Henry rarely engaged directly with her critiques. He preferred to focus on the mob narrative rather than domestic reckoning. His children distanced themselves in various ways. Growing up with a father publicly associated with betrayal and crime carries weight. The myth may fascinate strangers, but it burdens family. As the 2000s approached, Henry's health began reflecting years of substance abuse. Weight fluctuations, slurred speech in some interviews, fatigue that no amount of nostalgia could mask. He sometimes claimed sobriety publicly, At other times, arrests contradicted that claim. There were reports of him attempting small-time cons during these years, leveraging his notoriety for personal gain in ways that skirted legality. Nothing grand, nothing strategic, but consistent with a pattern of opportunism. Opportunism had defined him since adolescence. Now it defined him in decline. One particularly telling moment occurred during a late-night interview where the host asked whether he regretted flipping. Henry paused longer than usual. He didn't answer directly. Instead, he shifted to describing how dangerous the life had been, how inevitable prison would have been, how he had protected his family. That answer had always been his shield. But behind it, there was something else. Isolation. He was no longer part of the mob. He was no longer under federal protection. He was not fully embraced by mainstream society. He occupied a liminal space, too notorious for normalcy, too compromised for loyalty. The myth of the charming insider masked a deeper reality. He was adrift. There were moments of raw honesty in smaller interviews, admissions that he missed the old days, that he sometimes felt like he didn't belong anywhere. That anonymity had never suited him. But even those admissions were framed theatrically. He could not stop performing. Addiction continued weaving through his life like a thread he couldn't cut. Alcohol remained a constant. Cocaine resurfaced intermittently. Each relapse triggered another cycle of instability. By the early 2000s, the contrast between the cinematic Henry and the real man was stark. The film had frozen him in time. Sharp suit, confident voice, wry smile. Reality showed a man aging poorly, chasing relevance. He still told the Lufthansa story, still described the cab stand in Brooklyn, still narrated hijackings with vivid detail. But the repetition felt different now. Less like authority, more like rehearsal. There is a psychological phenomenon that occurs when a person's most defining life chapter happens early and publicly. The rest of life becomes footnote. Henry's peak notoriety had arrived with Goodfellas. Everything afterward felt like an echo. Financial strain increased. He reportedly worked as a chef for a time, leveraging his public persona. He embraced the irony of cooking, referencing the famous prison garlic slicing scene. Audiences found it charming. But charm does not pay medical bills consistently. He gave interviews where he contradicted earlier timelines again, claimed deeper involvement in strategic decisions, then retracted or softened those claims elsewhere. The unraveling wasn't dramatic. It was cumulative. Each inconsistency eroded authority. Each arrest eroded sympathy. Each relapse eroded stability. By the mid-2000s, he was a man known more for being the real-life inspiration behind a film than for the crimes themselves. The myth had eclipsed the man, and the man could not sustain the myth's energy. He sometimes spoke bitterly about former associates who had died in prison. He sometimes spoke nostalgically about loyalty he once believed in. He sometimes mocked the very code he had betrayed. That oscillation reflected internal conflict. He had spent decades justifying his flip as survival. But survival without belonging carries its own cost. There were interviews where he admitted he had embellished certain stories for effect. He would smile when saying it, as if to suggest everyone does it. But embellishment, when repeated, becomes distortion. And distortion, when accumulated, becomes doubt. The collapse of the myth was not a single revelation. It was a slow erosion. The public still loved Goodfellas, but fewer people believed Henry uncritically. He had once been positioned as the authoritative insider. Now he was seen by some as a flawed narrator whose truth required filtering. In quiet moments, away from cameras, he faced a reality few wanted to acknowledge. He had betrayed the mob. He had strained his family. He had lost witness protection. He had damaged his own credibility. And the fame that remained was tethered to a past he could no longer fully control. Addiction had ruined his standing within the mob. It had sabotaged witness protection. Now, it was eroding the final refuge he had built, his narrative. The collapse was not explosive. It was gradual, and by the time it became undeniable, there was little left to hold on to. The myth of Henry Hill still flickered in popular culture, but the man behind it was fading. And fading without loyalty, without protection, without stable family ties, is a lonely descent, one that would continue quietly into his final years. Chapter 14, Broke, Alone, and Still Telling Stories. Late 2000s to 2012. The last time he told a Lufthansa story in public, the room wasn't packed. There were no studio lights, no national television audience, just a modest crowd in a dim banquet hall somewhere in the Midwest. A folding table, a stack of glossy photos, a banner behind him with his name printed in bold letters, as if bold ink could preserve what time was quietly erasing. He leaned back in his chair, older now, heavier, the sharp edges of youth rounded by years of drinking and regret. His voice still carried rhythm when he wanted it to, still knew where to pause for effect, still knew how to let silence hang before delivering a punchline. But the silence didn't carry the same electricity anymore. It felt thinner. The myth of Henry Hill had outlived the man's relevance. By the late 2000s, he was no longer riding waves of mainstream attention. Goodfellas had become a classic, quoted, studied, rewatched, but cultural cycles moved forward. Younger audiences knew the film. Fewer knew the man. Henry tried to adapt. He did paid appearances at crime conventions, nightclub events, small-town theaters. He signed autographs for $20 apiece, posed for photographs with fans who wanted proximity to legend. Sometimes he leaned into self-awareness, joked about being the rat. Other times he bristled at the label. Rat. The word followed him everywhere. He insisted he had flipped to survive. He insisted he had no choice. He insisted that Jimmy Burke would have killed him. That claim, repeated over decades, had hardened into fact in his own mind. Whether or not Burke had truly planned to eliminate him is a question historians and law enforcement still debate. But Henry believed it, and belief shaped everything that followed. Financially, he was unstable. The money from Wise Guy and Goodfellas had not been structured to sustain him indefinitely. Appearance fees fluctuated. Book royalties slowed. He did not manage finances carefully. He never had. There were reports of unpaid bills, of short-term living arrangements, of reliance on event promoters to cover travel costs. This was not the image projected on screen. On screen, Henry lived fast but looked perpetually sharp. In reality, he looked tired. His health deteriorated gradually. Years of alcohol and cocaine had taken their toll. He struggled with weight. His voice sometimes slurred in interviews. He appeared on reality television briefly, attempting to remain visible. The irony was sharp. A former mob associate navigating the artificial drama of reality TV. He needed attention. Attention equaled relevance. Relevance equaled income. There were quieter days, too. Days when he stayed home, watching reruns of a film based on his own life. Observing Ray Liotta deliver lines that audiences had memorized. Watching his own mistakes transformed into art. There's something haunting about watching your past curated into something more coherent than it ever was. The film gave his life structure. Reality had been chaos. He sometimes expressed pride in the film's success. Other times he hinted that it didn't fully capture everything, that there were deeper layers, untold stories, hidden truths. The promise of more kept him in circulation. But how much more was there? By this stage, journalists revisiting his claims were more skeptical. Fact-checking had intensified over the years. Books and articles re-examined organized crime history with sharper scrutiny. Henry's role was placed in clearer context. Associate, not made man. Participant, not mastermind. He occasionally acknowledged that he had never been eligible for induction because his father was Irish. That fact had always been there, but he had once downplayed its significance publicly. Now it was harder to ignore. He was always an associate, never a sworn soldier, never a capo, never a boss. That distinction matters in mob hierarchy. It also matters in myth construction. As his health declined, so did the distance between performance and confession. In smaller interviews, he sometimes admitted he had exaggerated certain elements for dramatic effect. It makes a better story, he would say. That sentence reveals everything. Better story. Not necessarily truer story. He was still telling tales about the cab stand, about the glamour of early days, about the intensity of hijackings. But there was less swagger in the delivery. More fatigue. More repetition. The audience sizes shrank. The fees shrank. The myth endured in pop culture, but Henry's ability to monetize it diminished. Karen had long since distanced herself. The marriage had fractured beyond repair years earlier. His children were adults, navigating their own complicated relationships with his legacy. Family photos were less frequent. Appearances more solitary. He still had friends, event promoters, former fans turned acquaintances. But the tight-knit circle of belonging he once craved was gone. The mob world despised him. The federal system had discarded him after utility expired. Mainstream society saw him as a curiosity. That left Henry largely alone. He sometimes spoke nostalgically about Brooklyn, about the rhythm of his youth, about the men he once admired. But nostalgia can be deceptive. It highlights glow and erases cost. When asked if he regretted anything, he would oscillate. Some days he said no, survival justified everything. Other days, he admitted that addiction had ruined opportunities, that he had sabotaged witness protection, that he could have built something stable. Regrets surfaced in fragments, but regret never fully dominated his narrative. He clung to identity, even as that identity faded in public consciousness. By the early 2000s, organized crime had evolved. The romanticized mob era of the 1970s felt distant. Younger generations associated Mafia lore more with cinema than current events. Henry was part of cinematic nostalgia more than active history. And nostalgia doesn't pay consistently. His final years were marked by intermittent appearances, health challenges, and quieter living. He relocated several times. There were reports of medical issues tied to long-term substance abuse. He looked older than his age suggested. Yet even near the end, he continued telling stories. Sometimes to small audiences. Sometimes to local reporters. Sometimes to anyone who would listen at a bar. Storytelling had become reflex. It was how he maintained identity. Without the story, who was he? On June 12, 2012, Henry Hill died in Los Angeles from complications related to heart disease. He was 69 years old. He did not die wealthy. He did not die surrounded by the power structures he once admired. He did not die in witness protection. He died as a former mob associate turned informant turned storyteller. The headlines noted his connection to Goodfellas. They did not headline his net worth. They did not headline loyalty. They did not headline redemption. They referenced the film, because the film had become the dominant version of his life. The irony is almost unbearable. A man who had spent decades reshaping his narrative became best remembered through someone else's lens. Ray Liotta's performance immortalized a version of Henry that was sharper, more cohesive, more charismatic than the aging man signing autographs in small banquet halls. And yet, that cinematic immortality was built on Henry's own willingness to talk, to betray, to narrate. He had chosen survival over silence, chosen storytelling over obscurity, chosen relevance over loyalty. And in the end, relevance faded anyway. He died not in dramatic violence, not in a courtroom showdown, but in ordinary medical decline. The gangster who once feared being ordinary became exactly that, an aging man with heart disease. There is something poetic in that. He had chased proximity to power since childhood, chased belonging, chased attention, and ultimately, he was left with stories. Stories that were part truth, part embellishment. Stories that shaped public perception of organized crime. Stories that made him famous. Stories that isolated him. He once said he felt like a schnook in witness protection, living like an average nobody. In the end, average is what remained. The myth endured. The man did not. And as the applause faded in those final banquet halls, as the cameras turned toward newer subjects, Henry Hill was left with the only thing he had truly controlled. His version. The question that lingers now is simple. When a man is gone and only the story remains, which parts survive? And which parts dissolve with him? Chapter 15. The Rat Who Rewrote Himself. Long after the funeral flowers wilted, Henry Hill was still talking. Not in interviews, not in banquet halls, not on late-night television, but in living rooms across the world, on streaming platforms, on DVD shelves, On television reruns that air at midnight when the house is quiet and the audience leans in. His voice, or rather, Ray Liotta's voice, still narrates a version of events that feels sharp, intimate, alive. That is the final twist of the story. The man died in 2012. The myth did not. But myths are strange creatures. They survive not because they are perfect, but because they are compelling. And Henry Hill understood that better than most. From the beginning, he was never the most powerful man in the room. He was never a made member of the Lucchese family. He was never sworn in with ritual and blood because his father was Irish. That ceiling was always there, invisible, but immovable. No matter how many hijackings he joined, no matter how much money he earned, he would always remain an associate. Close, but not inside. And that proximity shaped everything. As a child, he watched power from across the street. As a teenager, he ran errands for men who barely noticed him. As a young adult, he stood near Jimmy Burke, close enough to feel important, far enough to be replaceable. As a husband, he performed control while chaos grew inside his home. As a drug dealer, he convinced himself he was expanding when he was actually isolating. As an informant, he told himself he was surviving when he was also dismantling his own identity. And as a public figure, he rewrote himself into something cleaner, sharper, more central. That is the pattern. He never held ultimate power, so he chased narrative power instead. When he flipped in 1980, he crossed a line that cannot be uncrossed. In organized crime, cooperation is not just betrayal, it is erasure. Your name is struck from circles that once acknowledged you. Your history is recast. You're no longer associate, no longer brother, no longer earner. You are rat. And once that word attaches to you, it becomes permanent. Henry could not return to the mob. He could not remain comfortably in witness protection. So he did the only thing left. He built a new identity around the act of telling. Storytelling became armor. If he could narrate the world he left behind, he could control how it remembered him. Wise Guy framed him as insider guide. Goodfellas immortalized him as charismatic antihero. But what did those narratives omit? They softened the domestic abuse. They compressed the addiction. They stylized the violence. They elevated his centrality. Cinema requires cohesion. Life rarely provides it. Henry was not the mastermind of the Lufthansa heist. He was not the most feared enforcer. He was not the strategic architect of mob operations. He was a participant, a mid-level associate who rode the currents created by men above him. But in telling the story, he adjusted the angle of the camera. He made himself the through line, and audiences followed. That is the strange brilliance of his final transformation. He betrayed the mob for survival. Then he monetized the betrayal for relevance. Then he mythologized the monetization for legacy. And somewhere inside that layered process, the original version of Henry Hill became harder to see. The real Henry was more volatile than the film suggests, more erratic, more selfish, more dependent on substances that hollowed him out over time. He participated in beatings. He enabled violence. He carried fear home to his wife and children. He ignored explicit warnings not to deal drugs and risk federal attention. He was not a passive observer caught in events beyond his control. He made choices, repeatedly, and yet, he was also human. That complexity matters. He was a boy who idolized power before he understood its cost. He was a man who confused proximity with importance. He was an addict who mistook adrenaline for purpose. He was a husband who could not separate ego from cruelty. He was a father who loved in fragments. He was an informant who justified betrayal as necessity. He was a storyteller who blurred edges until even he may not have known where truth ended and embellishment began. The public often prefers villains or heroes. Henry was neither in clean form. He was an opportunist. Opportunism defined him from adolescence to death. When he ran errands, it was opportunism. When he joined hijackings, it was opportunism. When he dealt drugs against orders, it was opportunism. When he flipped to avoid decades in prison, it was opportunism. When he sold his story, it was opportunism. The through line is not loyalty. It is survival paired with ego. That does not make him unique in criminal history, but it makes him instructive. Because Henry Hill represents something broader than one man's rise and fall. He represents the myth of the charming gangster and the uncomfortable truth beneath it. Goodfellas invites viewers into a world of rhythm and bravado. It makes crime feel kinetic, alive, seductive. But beneath that energy is a quieter reality. Addiction corrodes. Violence scars. Loyalty is conditional. And betrayal, even when justified as survival, isolates. Henry died without mob loyalty. He died without federal protection. He died without substantial wealth. He died remembered not as a boss, not as a feared enforcer, but as the rat. Yet he also died immortalized in cinema. That contradiction is the final irony. He betrayed the code of silence, omerta, and in doing so became one of the most famous voices in Mafia history. He broke the code, and the world rewarded him with attention. But attention is not peace. Attention is not belonging. Attention is not redemption. If there is a final truth in his story, it may be this. Henry Hill never truly left the criminal mindset. Even after flipping, even after relocating, even after appearing on television, the instinct to maneuver, to reframe, to leverage, to embellish, to chase relevance, those habits never left. He changed arenas. He did not change psychology. In his final years, as health declined and audience sizes shrank, he continued telling the same stories. Because without them, he risked becoming ordinary. And ordinary was the one fate he feared most. As a boy, he looked across the street at men who seemed larger than life. He did not want to be invisible. Ironically, the nickname given to Dominic Cirillo in another story was Invisible Dom. Henry Hill spent his life resisting invisibility. He chased visibility at every stage. And in doing so, he created a legacy built as much on performance as fact. The real Henry Hill was not as glamorous as the film, not as central as his interview suggested, not as sympathetic as the screenplay sometimes implies. He was more flawed, more erratic, more contradictory. He was a man who stood close to power, but never possessed it. And when that proximity evaporated, he replaced it with narrative control. The rat who lied about everything is an oversimplification. He did not fabricate his entire life, but he adjusted it, polished it, expanded it, compressed it, until it fit the rhythm audiences expected. And in the end, that may be the most honest thing about him. He was always performing, always adapting, always rewriting himself to survive the moment. The final image is not cinematic. It is quiet. An aging man in Los Angeles. Health failing. Past receding. No crew behind him. No federal marshals guarding him. No spotlight burning bright. Just a name that still echoes in pop culture. Henry Hill. Associate. Informant. Storyteller. Rat. And if we strip away the soundtrack, the camera angles, the applause, what remains is a cautionary tale about ambition without limits, loyalty without stability, and narrative without restraint. Because once you rewrite yourself often enough, you may forget which version was real. And when that happens, the myth survives. But the man disappears.